There's a moment in the very first episode of Invincible where Nolan Grayson walks into a quiet room full of people who trusted him, friends he had stood beside for years, and changes the entire show in about the length of a single conversation. He doesn't shout, he doesn't explain himself. He just decides, very calmly, that the world he has been pretending to belong to is finished, and then he ends them one by one. It is one of the most chilling sequences in modern animation, and it tells you everything you need to know about the man you are about to spend the next few hours thinking about. Tonight, here on Rock, we are putting that man into a room with the most feared character on a different show entirely, Homelander from The Boys, and we are working out, very slowly, very carefully, who actually walks out. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and if you haven't subscribed yet, it genuinely does help us keep making these. To do this honestly, we have to start by drawing both of them at the kind of resolution they deserve, because half of the arguments people have about this fight are arguments between two characters who don't actually exist, two flattened internet versions made of memes and out-of-context clips. The real Nolan Grayson, the one Invincible has carefully shown us over its run on Amazon, is not the smirking father from the diner scene memes. He is a Viltrumite, born into a culture of conquest, raised to believe that strength is the only language the universe respects, sent to Earth as a sleeper agent with one job: soften this planet for the empire that is on its way. The show does not hide this, and Robert Kirkman does not soften it. Across the opening hour of the first episode, we see him working alongside the Guardians of the Globe, calling them by their first names, joking with them in the way coworkers joke after a long week. By the end of that episode, he has killed every single one of them, slowly and methodically, in a fight that the show treats not as a battle but as an execution. Watching it back, knowing what is coming, is almost unbearable, because you can see the moment he allows the mask to drop, and you realize that the kind father, the husband, the team player you spent 40 minutes with was always a costume. That is the man we are talking about. The other man, Homelander, is the product of a very different writer's room. The Boys, originally a comic by Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson, and adapted for Amazon by Eric Kripke, treats its central super not as an alien with a hidden purpose, but as a corporate experiment that learned to read its own press releases. Homelander, played in the live-action show by Antony Starr, was grown in a laboratory by a corporation called Vought International, raised with no parents, no warmth, no real childhood, and then sold to the public as a smiling all-American symbol. The show is obsessed with what that kind of upbringing produces. Across its seasons, it has shown him as needy, vain, theatrical, sentimental, cruel, lonely, and dangerous, in roughly that order, sometimes in the same scene. In many ways, he is the opposite of Omni-Man. Omni-Man knows exactly who he is and is hiding it. Homelander has no idea who he is and is performing constantly. That difference, more than any difference in strength or speed, ends up mattering more than the internet usually gives it credit for. But we will get to that. For now, before we start measuring punches and lasers and flight speeds, it is worth saying out loud what kind of conversation this is. Omni-Man comes from Invincible, which is a comic and an animated show, and Homelander comes from The Boys, which is a comic and a live-action show. They have never actually fought on screen. There is no canonical answer. What we can do, and what this video is going to do for the next few hours, is take everything that is actually established about each of them in their own canons, weigh it carefully, and reason our way toward an answer that respects the writing on both sides. We are not doing a hype fight. We are not doing one of those videos where the host just shouts that their favorite wins. We are going to do this the way you would do it if you were sitting up late at night and your brain refused to switch off, and you needed to think about something complicated enough to wear you out gently, which is of course exactly the point. So let's start with the man on home turf, Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man, the Viltrumite who chose this planet as his hunting ground. Everything that follows about him is drawn from what Invincible itself shows on screen, with the comic noted only where the two diverge, or where it adds context that the show has not yet aired. The Viltrumite race, in the show's telling, is an interstellar empire of beings who look almost identical to humans, with the same general body plan and the same general size range. Their biology is something else entirely. Viltrumites are far stronger than they look, far faster than the human eye can track, durable enough to survive the kind of impacts that should kill any organic body, capable of flight without any visible means of propulsion, capable of breathing in space for long stretches, and equipped with senses far sharper than human senses. They age slowly, they heal quickly, and they live for centuries. The Empire built itself by going from planet to planet and conquering, sometimes by direct combat, more often by inserting agents like Nolan into the existing power structure and softening it from the inside. Invincible is patient about this. In the first season, you do not know any of it. You see a strange, slightly cold father, a slightly too clean superhero costume, a perfect house, a sometimes tense marriage, a son who is just coming into his powers and worshipping his dad the way teenage boys do. You see Nolan being kind, in his slightly awkward way, to his wife Debbie. You see him bonding with Mark over the family business. The signs are there if you look carefully. The way he discusses violence as a tool, the way he discusses other heroes as if they are barely worth his time, the way he describes earlier eras of his life in language that does not quite match a human upbringing. But on first watch, you do not see it. You think you are watching a slightly grittier Superman story. Then the first episode ends in a slaughterhouse, and the show tells you, very clearly, that you have been watching a different show the entire time. What Invincible does with Nolan after that opening kill is more interesting than the kill itself. Across the first season finale, across the second season, and across what has followed, the story refuses to let him be a simple villain. He is allowed to feel guilt without being absolved. He is allowed to love his son without being redeemed by it. He is shown, in long stretches of dialogue, trying to justify a worldview that he is no longer sure he believes in. The famous father and son confrontation in the first season finale, where he tries to explain to Mark why human lifespans should not matter to a being like him, is a sequence the show treats seriously as a piece of philosophy, not as a villain monologue. Mark's counterargument, that his short life with his mother and his classmates would be his actual life, breaks something in Nolan that does not get fixed on screen for several seasons. The show is careful, also, never to claim that this means Nolan has become a hero. He is a war criminal who occasionally helps. That is the version of him you have to imagine standing in this hypothetical fight. The other thing that has to be said about Nolan, because it is the thing that makes him different from almost any other character in his weight class, is that he is genuinely, demonstrably experienced. Not in the way that comics often claim experience, by saying that a character is a veteran of many wars in a single line of exposition. Invincible actually shows him, in flashbacks and in current events, conducting himself the way a man who has fought for centuries would conduct himself. He measures opponents quickly. He does not waste energy. He does not posture. When he hits something, he hits it once, with the intention of ending the conversation immediately, and he does not stay near the impact in case it gets up. He uses environments as weapons. He uses civilian populations as leverage when it suits him. He understands, in a way that almost nobody else in either show understands, that combat between beings at this scale is not a sporting event. It is a problem to be solved, and the cleanest solution is almost always the most savage one. We are going to come back to this point a lot, because it is the single most important asymmetry in this entire matchup. Now to the other half of the room. Homelander, as the boys writes him, has a fundamentally different relationship with his own power. The show makes a point of telling us, repeatedly, that he was not born in any meaningful sense. He was made. The corporation that produced him, Vought International, injected children with a substance called Compound V, a serum that produces superpowered individuals with no consistent rules about who gets which abilities. Homelander, in the live-action show's telling, was raised in laboratory conditions, isolated, tested, conditioned, and trained, from infancy to be the face of Vought's super team, the Seven. He had no parents in any normal sense. He had handlers. He had a corporation that loved him the way a corporation loves a product, which is to say, only as long as he was selling. The show keeps coming back to this. In flashbacks, in dialogue, in the way he behaves around children, in the way he behaves around the few people who have ever shown him real affection, you can see the shape of what Vought did to him, and the show treats that shape with a strange, queasy sympathy that never quite tips into forgiveness. His powers, on paper, sound very similar to Omni-Man's. Super strength, flight, heat vision, which the show often calls laser vision, but treats as the same kind of ability Omni-Man uses. Super hearing, some level of enhanced vision, which the show has used at different points to suggest X-ray sight or telescopic sight depending on the scene. Invulnerability sufficient to walk through small arms fire without flinching, the ability to fly fast enough to be a serious threat from any altitude. But the show is also quietly careful about what it does not give him. It almost never shows him in a real fight with someone in his own weight class. The fights he picks tend to be against ordinary humans, against weaker supes, against people who cannot hurt him back. When he does brush up against someone genuinely his equal, like Soldier Boy, the show suggests that he is more vulnerable than his press releases would imply. We will come back to that, because that fight, more than any other piece of evidence on screen, is the thing that gives us the clearest read on his actual ceiling. What the show emphasizes instead, again and again, is his psychology. He is needy in a way that almost defies belief for a man with his abilities. He craves the love of the public, and confuses that love with the love he never received as a child. He cycles through father figures, attaches to them, idealizes them, then murders them when they disappoint him, which they all eventually do. He cycles through romantic and sexual obsessions that look less like attraction and more like demands for proof that he is real. He performs constantly, even when he is alone, because the cameras have been on him his entire life, and he no longer knows how to exist without performing. The longer the show runs, the more clearly it argues that the most dangerous thing about Homelander is not his heat vision and not his strength. It is the fact that any sufficiently large humiliation could make him stop caring about consequences entirely. The version of him that walks into a fight after a public humiliation is far more dangerous than the version that walks in confident, and almost any opponent who knew his psychology would try to make sure the second version is the one who shows up. It is worth pausing here to say something honest about the comic versions, because they exist, and they differ. In Ennis's original comic, Homelander is a slightly different character, written in a more openly grotesque register, with backstory elements the show has chosen not to use. In Kirkman's original Invincible comic, Nolan's arc, the Viltrumite War, the eventual political shifts on Viltrum and on Earth, all go places that the animated show may or may not eventually reach. For the purposes of this video, we are going to lean on the shows because they are the versions most people are actually carrying around in their heads, and because mixing comic feats with show feats produces the kind of Frankenstein argument that wins forum threads but ruins this kind of analysis. Where the comic adds something useful that the show has not contradicted, we will mention it and flag it. Where the comic disagrees with the show, we will use the show. That is the only way to do this without lying. So that is who we have. On one side, Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man, a Viltrumite sleeper agent and centuries-old soldier, written by Kirkman as a man who knows exactly who he is and what he is capable of, and has spent most of his life pretending otherwise. On the other side, Homelander, a corporate experiment grown in a lab by Vought International, raised without love, written by Kripke and his room, as a man whose psychology is the loudest thing in any room he enters. Two beings, with broadly similar power sets, almost completely opposite inner lives, and one question hanging over the entire conversation, which is, if they actually met, which one walks away? To answer that, we need to take both of their power sets, both of their histories, and both of their habits of mind, and we need to compare them carefully, without cheating for either side. Let's start at the bottom, with the simplest question of all, which is how strong each of them actually is. Raw strength is the thing the internet wants to start with, and the thing that turns out to be one of the smaller asymmetries in the matchup, but it is the right place to begin because it sets the floor for everything else. Omni-Man's strength, as the show has presented it, is not a fixed number. It is more like a register he can step up to depending on the situation. In casual moments, working with his son, training, helping with disasters, he is comfortably stronger than any non-Viltrumite character we have seen, but he is not visibly straining. In the Guardians fight at the end of the first episode, he uses just enough force to end each member, not a kilogram more. Against the Mauler twins, against the various mid-tier threats of the first season, he holds back so reflexively that the show uses his restraint as characterization. The first time we really see what he can do in a serious extended fight is the famous Chicago sequence at the end of the first season, where his fight with Mark levels city blocks, throws bodies through high-speed trains, and produces shockwaves that you can read on the buildings around them. That fight is the closest the show has come to letting Nolan use his actual capability on screen, and even there he is plainly holding back compared to what later seasons hint he can do against beings his own age. Homelander's strength has been shown more inconsistently. The Boys is, by design, a show that prizes character and consequence over consistent power scaling, and Kripke and his writers have spoken in interviews about treating Homelander's abilities as a slider that moves with the story's needs. What is consistent is that he is comfortably stronger than any normal human, more than strong enough to tear a person in half with a casual gesture, fast enough to close the distance on a fleeing target before they can react, and durable enough that the kind of small arms fire that would kill an ordinary soup simply bounces off him. The fight that comes closest to telling us his real ceiling is the Soldier Boy sequence, where another Vought-era super with comparable abilities is able to hurt him badly, and force him to retreat. That moment is the single most important data point we have, because it tells us that there is a level of force, somewhere in the upper range of what the show treats as super, that can actually damage him, and that he knows it. Already, even just on the raw strength axis, you can see the asymmetry starting to form. Omni-Man's strength is shown against Viltrumite peers and against other characters at that scale, and it is enough to demolish them. Homelander's strength is mostly shown against weaker opponents, and the one time it is tested against a peer, it does not come out cleanly. That alone is not a knockout argument, because Soldier Boy is a specific kind of opponent, and his abilities are not the same as Nolan's. But it does set the floor. If Homelander struggles against a Soldier Boy class opponent, and Nolan handles Soldier Boy class opponents the way he handled the Guardians of the Globe, the gap between their effective strength is bigger than the trailers and the marketing imagery have led casual viewers to believe. It is also worth noting, while we are on this axis, the texture of how each of them uses strength. Nolan does not flail, he does not telegraph, he does not make wide swings. He places his hits, and he places them where they will end the fight in one motion. The Guardian sequence is a study in this, because each kill is essentially a single deliberate movement, and each one targets a specific anatomical weakness of the character he is killing. The Aquarus drowning, the Red Rush moment, the way he handles Martian Man, all of them are calibrated. Compare that to the way Homelander uses his strength in the show. He throws people, he kicks through walls, he lifts a man into the air and lets him fall. The motions are theatrical, designed for an audience, even when no audience is present. He has been performing his whole life, and even his violence has the shape of a performance. In a fight against someone who has no interest in performing, that shape becomes a problem. Speed is the next axis, and it is the one where the assumptions break down most often, because both shows are inconsistent about it, and both shows are willing to bend it for a scene. The honest version goes like this. Omni-Man, in the moments when Invincible is treating him as a serious threat, moves at speeds that the human eye cannot follow. He covers continents in flight. He crosses solar systems in a way that the show treats as taking weeks rather than seconds, which suggests that his deep space travel speed is faster than light by some margin, but is not effectively instantaneous in the way some comic Viltrumites are written. Inside an atmosphere, in a combat situation, the show usually depicts him as moving faster than his opponents can track, but slow enough that you, the viewer, can see him doing it. That second half is a storytelling decision, not a power-level statement. The show needs you to see the fight, so the camera slows him to a speed you can register. The actual implied speed, drawn from the lore and from the way other Viltrumites move when they finally show up, is much higher than what you see in any given panel of action. Homelander's speed is less consistent. The Boys depicts him crossing rooms in a flash when the story calls for menace, and flying across continents when the story needs him to be somewhere quickly. He has been shown overtaking ordinary jets. He has been shown reacting to bullets and to the muzzle flash of guns aimed at people he cares about. But he has also been shown in long extended scenes where he is moving at speeds that look, charitably, only modestly faster than a fit human. The most consistent read is that he is fast enough to be effectively impossible for ordinary humans to fight, fast enough to win the close-range exchange against most weaker soups, but slow enough that, in the rare fights where he faces an equal, the speed gap is not what decides the outcome. That is a critical point. Against an equal, he wins or loses on power, not speed. Compared like that, the gap is again wider than the trailers suggest. Omni-Man's combat speed, drawn from his fights with Mark, with Battle Beast, and with other Viltrumites later in the show, is the kind of speed where if he chooses to close on you, you do not get a meaningful chance to react. Homelander's combat speed is the kind of speed where if he chooses to close on you, an equal opponent does get a meaningful chance to react. If we hold this difference still in our heads, even before we add in experience or psychology, the trajectory of the fight starts to take shape. Nolan can decide when contact begins, Homelander cannot. Flight is closely related but worth treating separately because both characters have it, and both shows use it in slightly different ways. Omni-Man flies in a way that Invincible never explains and never feels the need to explain. He simply rises, hangs, and accelerates. He has no jet exhaust, no manipulation of wind, No obvious propulsion. He can carry passengers. He can carry his son. He can fly into orbit and back. He has been depicted in long, deep space sequences moving from planet to planet under his own power, which implies that whatever the Viltrumite biology does to enable flight, it includes the ability to operate without breathing for extended periods and to push through whatever lies between solar systems. The show has shown Viltrumites surviving in the vacuum of space without visible protective equipment and engaging in combat there. Whatever flight is, in this canon, it is not a trick. It is a fundamental part of what these beings are. Homelander's flight, in The Boys, is shown differently. He can leave the ground, he can climb, he can fly across the country in the time it takes to be needed somewhere. But the show has not depicted him operating in deep space, has not shown him crossing interplanetary distances, and has not depicted him as comfortably spaceborne. He has been shown at high altitude, in airliners, on the outside of jets, and at the edge of the atmosphere in some sequences, but the show treats those as feats, not casual movements. That distinction matters. If the fight ever leaves the Earth's atmosphere, even briefly, Omni-Man's biology is at home, and Homelander's may not be. Whether Homelander can survive in space, breathe without air, or close on an opponent across a hard vacuum is genuinely unclear in the show. The honest read is that he probably can survive briefly but cannot fight effectively, while Omni-Man can do both indefinitely. If you are Nolan, and you wanted to take a fight to an environment where your opponent is on uncertain ground, the upper atmosphere is the most obvious place to go. Now durability, which is the axis where the matchup is most often distorted online. The internet loves to argue that Homelander is unkillable, because of how the show frames him in his fights with humans, and to argue that Omni-Man is fragile, because the comic shows him bleeding in extended fights with other Viltrumites. Both of those arguments are wrong. They are both wrong in the same way. They both confuse the level of force being applied with the underlying durability of the character. Of course, Omni-Man bleeds in a fight with other Viltrumites. They are the only beings in the canon strong enough to make him bleed. The fact that he bleeds against them does not mean he would bleed against weaker opponents. And of course, Homelander walks through gunfire. So would Omni-Man. So would any character at their tier. The relevant question is not whether they are durable against bullets. They both are. The relevant question is what level of force is required to actually hurt each of them, and how much of that level of force the other one can deliver. For Omni-Man, the answer is that we have seen him take, on screen, the kind of impacts that level skyscrapers and survive them without serious lasting damage. His fight with Mark at the end of the first season includes blows that would atomize any human, and that Mark himself can deliver, and Nolan walks away from it. The fights with Viltrumite peers in later seasons show him taking real damage from beings of comparable power, recovering and continuing. The show has been careful not to invent invulnerability for him. He bleeds, he bruises, he tires. But the level at which he begins to take damage is the level of Viltrumite versus Viltrumite combat, which is well above the level any of the heroes of either show normally operate at. For Homelander, the answer is less clean. He has been shown to be effectively bulletproof. He has been shown to shrug off blunt impacts. He has also been shown to be visibly injured by Soldier Boy, who operates somewhere in the upper tier of soups. He has been hurt, on screen, by attacks that Omni-Man would not have noticed. That gives us a ceiling for Homelander's durability, and that ceiling is below the level at which Nolan operates casually. There is one piece of in-show evidence that complicates this slightly, which is the various moments where Homelander has briefly tangled with other soups who are clearly weaker than him, but still capable of pressuring him under the right conditions, by most accounts in late seasons. Those moments tell us that he is not invulnerable, even to weaker soups, given the right angle. They also tell us that he is dangerous primarily because most of the people who could pressure him do not choose to, not because he is fundamentally above pressure. This is a very different durability profile from Omni-Man, who is dangerous because he is fundamentally above pressure from almost any being he encounters. That is the gap. There is also the question, which the internet loves, and which we have to take seriously, of weaknesses. Both shows have established weaknesses for their leads, although the weaknesses are different in kind. Viltrumites, in the show, have shown themselves to be vulnerable to certain kinds of high-frequency sound, and to the kind of precise psychic and biological attacks that show up in later seasons. The sequids and the various other species the show has introduced have at different points caused real difficulty for Viltrumites, although usually only when there are many of them or when they target very specific physiological weak points. Nolan himself has been visibly hurt by ear targeting, by frequency-based attacks, and by the kind of precise high-force impacts that Viltrumite combat produces. He is not unkillable, but the things that can kill him are very, very specific. Homelander's weaknesses are murkier. The show has implied at various points that he can be hurt by other supes of sufficient power, by certain weapons that Vought has developed, and by certain compounds. The most consistent in show vulnerability, by most accounts, is the anti-supe weapon, the device that has been used in late seasons of the show, which works by introducing certain compounds at the right level to disrupt supe physiology. He has also shown psychological vulnerabilities, fears around isolation, around losing the love of his audience, around proving himself, that opponents have exploited to dangerous effect. But in terms of pure physical weakness, the show has been deliberately ambiguous. The argument that he is unkillable by physical means is one the show invites and then keeps undermining, just enough to keep the question open. That ambiguity is, on balance, less helpful in this matchup than people think, because it means we cannot point to a specific exploit. We can only point to evidence of what has hurt him in the past, and Soldier Boy is the cleanest example, and Nolan operates above Soldier Boy. Heat vision, or laser eyes, depending on which show you are watching, is the next axis, and it deserves its own conversation because it is the one range tool both characters genuinely share. Omni-Man, in Invincible, uses heat vision sparingly but devastatingly. The show has shown him melting steel structures, cutting through reinforced materials, and using narrow beams as precision weapons. He does not lean on it the way some other characters do, partly because most of his fights take place at close range, and partly because his preferred method of dispatching opponents is direct physical force. When he does use it, it is precise, and it is decisive. The Guardian sequence, in particular, includes a moment where the show implies, without belaboring it, that he could have ended several of those opponents from across the room, and chose not to because the up-close kill made more of a statement. Homelander, by contrast, leans on his heat vision constantly. The show treats it as one of his most reliable threats. He has used it on humans, on supes, on objects, on entire crowds. He has used it as a method of execution, as a method of intimidation, and, in some of the show's most uncomfortable sequences, as a method of expression in moments where he cannot control his anger. The Boys depicts his heat vision as more freely fired than Omni-Man's, but not necessarily more powerful. The maximum on-screen output, in terms of what he has actually cut through with it, is roughly comparable to what Omni-Man has cut through. The real difference is that he uses it as a first resort, and Nolan uses it as a third or fourth resort. That is a stylistic difference more than a power difference. In a fight between the two of them, the heat vision question would matter primarily at the opening. If they enter the engagement at any kind of range, both of them can deliver a beam attack. Both of them can take a beam attack, at least briefly. Both of them have the visual acuity to track an incoming beam and angle their head to deflect or shed the worst of the heat. The way these exchanges have been depicted in both shows, beam against beam, tends to end either in a stalemate, with the beams pushing against each other, or in one character closing the distance to make it physical. In a stalemate, the closer fighter wins, and the closer fighter, in this matchup, is almost always going to be Nolan. He moves first, he moves harder, and he is comfortable in the close-range exchange. Homelander, in the rare fights where he has been pushed into close range against an equal, tends to give ground. The senses, finally. Both shows give their leads enhanced senses, with some variation. Omni-Man has shown the ability to hear conversations from impossible distances, to see at the kind of resolution that allows him to track threats from far away, and to register subtle physical cues, like heart rate, that humans cannot perceive. He has not been depicted with X-ray vision in the show in any sustained way, although the comic flirts with it. Homelander has been depicted with X-ray vision, with telescopic vision, with super hearing, and with the ability to identify specific people by their heartbeats in a crowd. Both of them are dangerously perceptive. In a fight, each of them would be aware of what the other was doing well before contact. The difference, again, is what they do with that perception. Nolan uses information to choose the moment of attack. Homelander uses information to choose the moment of threat. The difference between an attack and a threat is the difference between a fight that has already begun and a fight that one side is still preparing for. That gap, even a fraction of a second wide, is where Nolan wins openings. We have walked through, now, the entire raw power picture. Strength, where Nolan has a clear edge in demonstrated ceiling against peers. Speed, where Nolan has a clearer edge in combat applicable acceleration. Flight, where Nolan has a clear edge in environmental flexibility, especially in space. Durability, where Nolan has a clearer edge in demonstrated ability to absorb peer-level impacts. Heat vision, where they are roughly comparable in maximum output but very different in habit of use. Senses, where they are roughly comparable in resolution but again very different in habit. If the fight were decided on raw power alone, Nolan wins, comfortably, and the comments section is angry. But fights are never decided on raw power alone, and the more interesting argument for Homelander, the one that comes closest to actually putting this fight in doubt, is the argument from psychology and unpredictability. So we owe that argument its full hearing now. Before we get to psychology though, we need to deal with experience, because it is the single largest gap between these two characters, and it is the one that most often gets undersold in online debates. Omni-Man is, by his own statement and by the show's depiction, several centuries old. He has fought in interstellar wars. He has personally conquered entire planets. He has trained at the highest level of the Viltrumite military, which the show treats as the most ruthless and effective fighting force in the known universe. He has tactical experience, strategic experience, single combat experience, group combat experience, and political experience. He knows how to fight a stronger opponent, how to fight a weaker opponent, how to fight several opponents at once, how to fight on the ground, in the sky, in the water, in a vacuum, and in the kind of environments where standard physics begins to bend. He has fought, in the show's later seasons, beings whose abilities exceed his own, and beings whose abilities are roughly comparable, and he has come out of those fights either with a victory or with a survival, almost every time. Homelander, by contrast, has the experience of a celebrity. He has been alive for the lifespan of a tall, lean adult man, however long that is in the show's timeline. He has been in fights, but most of those fights have been controlled events, stage-managed by Vought, in environments designed to make him look good. The real fights he has been in, the ones that have not been stage-managed, have all happened in the last few seasons of the show. He has fought small groups of humans, he has fought weaker supes, he has fought Soldier Boy. That is, essentially, the full list. He has never fought a being who was physically and psychologically prepared to kill him. He has never fought a being who was older than him. He has never fought a being who had nothing to prove. He has never fought, in other words, an Omni-Man. This experience gap shows up in dozens of small ways that are easy to miss. Nolan, in fights, breathes evenly. He paces himself. He never looks angry, even when he is being attacked. He targets vulnerable points without telegraphing. He uses the environment, throwing opponents into walls, into buildings, into the ground, in ways that conserve his own energy. He stays oriented in three-dimensional space. He recovers from being hit by repositioning rather than by retreating. He almost never makes the same mistake twice in a single fight. These are not flashy traits. The show does not call attention to them. They are simply what a centuries-old soldier looks like when he is fighting. Homelander, by contrast, in his fights with comparable opponents, has been depicted breathing heavily, posturing, monologuing in moments where action would serve him better, and retreating to a defensive posture when surprised. He is not a coward. He is just not a soldier. He has never had to be one. There is one possible counter-argument here, which is that Homelander's lack of experience is offset by his theatricality, that he might do something genuinely unpredictable that a more disciplined fighter cannot anticipate. The argument has some weight. Improvisation in combat is real. The Boys has shown him doing things that an opponent could not have prepared for, like deploying his heat vision in the middle of a conversation, or attacking through a hostage, or refusing to retreat in a moment where retreat would have been the correct call. Against an opponent who expected discipline, that kind of unpredictability could buy time or even buy a hit. But the problem is that Nolan does not expect discipline. He has fought enemies who attacked through hostages. He has fought enemies who deployed surprise attacks mid-conversation. He has fought enemies whose entire approach was theatrical. He recognizes those moves as moves, not as surprises. The most unpredictable thing Homelander could do against Nolan is unfortunately the thing Nolan would predict. That leads us, finally, to the question that the internet always wants to start with and that we have deliberately saved for late, which is whether Homelander's willingness to kill, his sheer absence of moral restraint, gives him an edge against an opponent who, in his current arc, sometimes shows restraint. The argument runs like this. Yes, Nolan is stronger and faster and more experienced, but he hesitates. He hesitates because of Mark, because of Debbie, because of his slow drift away from Viltrumite ideology. Homelander does not hesitate. Therefore, the fight, on a given day, could turn on Homelander's willingness to act without conscience, in a way Nolan would not. It is a clean argument, and it deserves a clean answer. The answer is no, and the reason is that the version of Nolan you have to imagine in this fight is not the version from the late seasons of the show. He is not the version sitting in a cell, regretting. He is not the version having long talks with Mark. He is the version with his costume on, with his mustache, with his Viltrumite training intact, treated as the threat that he is. That version of Nolan does not hesitate. That version of Nolan ended the Guardians of the Globe in a single sustained sequence and walked home and ate dinner with his family. That version of Nolan, given a target, treats the target as a problem to be solved. The argument that Homelander's psychology gives him an edge depends on importing a version of Nolan from a different point in the story. Against the Nolan who, in the show, has actually been willing to kill, Homelander's willingness to kill is not a difference. It is a tie. And once it is a tie, every other axis, where Nolan has an edge, becomes the deciding factor. There is, however, a much more interesting version of the psychology argument, which is not about willingness to kill, but about reaction to harm. Homelander, in the show, has a documented history of becoming more dangerous when humiliated. When he is mocked, when he is rejected, when he is publicly diminished, his behavior becomes less calculated and more destructive. There is a real argument that, in a fight where Nolan was visibly winning, Homelander's reaction to the humiliation of losing could destabilize him in ways that produce sudden bursts of unfocused but very high output. The image of Homelander, knowing he is losing, choosing to unleash everything he has in a single suicidal exchange because he cannot bear to be seen losing, is the most plausible version of a scenario where Nolan takes serious damage. It is not a path to a Homelander victory, it is a path to a costly Nolan victory. But it is the most honest argument the pro-Homelander side has, and it would be intellectually dishonest to dismiss it. To take that argument seriously, we have to think about how a fight between these two would actually go. Not the abstract version, the specific version. We need to think about what each side would do in the opening seconds, in the first sustained exchange, and in the closing window where one of them realizes he is losing. We need to think about location, because location matters. We need to think about whether either of them has time to prepare, because preparation, even a few minutes of it, changes everything. And we need to think about what would actually end the fight, because the question is not just who wins on points, the question is what wins. So let's walk through a few scenarios, and let's be honest about the uncertainty in each one. Scenario 1. They meet by accident, in a city, in daylight, both of them at full strength, neither of them with allies, neither of them with preparation. Homelander is on a public appearance. Omni-Man is passing through. They see each other and they recognize each other for what each other is. What happens in the first second? The honest answer is that what happens in the first second is that both of them stop and read the other. Both of them have the senses to know they are looking at something dangerous. Both of them have the experience, in different amounts, to know that opening with violence in a populated area is a different decision from opening with violence in private. The question of who throws the first punch, in this scenario, depends on who is more willing to accept the collateral. And, awkwardly for Homelander's image, the answer is Nolan. Nolan would absolutely accept the collateral. He has, in the show, accepted civilian collateral many times, both as a means of pressure and as an incidental consequence of fighting in a populated area. Homelander, for all his cruelty in private, has spent his life avoiding the kind of public mass casualty event that would damage his standing with the audience. In a public city fight, Nolan starts swinging first. Homelander, for at least a few seconds, would still be performing for an audience, and a few seconds is more than enough for Nolan to put him through a building. The shape of the city fight from there is unkind to Homelander. Nolan would, in the show's pattern, pick up the largest available object, throw Homelander through it, and follow up at full speed. Homelander, slammed through a structure, would be hurt, but would also be free of any obligation to perform once the fight had visibly begun. From that point, we get something close to a fair fight, although fair only in the sense that both fighters are now committed. Nolan still has the strength edge, the speed edge, the experience edge, and the durability edge. The only thing Homelander can do, in this exchange is try to relocate the fight upward, into the air, or laterally, away from the civilian center, so that he has time to reset. Nolan would not allow either. He would chase, he would close, he would land successive hits, each one calibrated to do real damage rather than to look impressive. Within the first minute of the fight, by the show's pattern of escalation, Homelander would be visibly injured, while Nolan would still be calibrating. Scenario 2. They meet in the air, at altitude, with neither of them on the ground, neither of them limited by an audience. This is closer to a clean test of their abilities, because the environment removes most of the variables that the city introduces. Here, Nolan's edges in flight ability matter the most. At altitude, his comfort in three-dimensional movement is the kind of edge that produces a one-sided fight. He would, by his pattern, climb above Homelander and force him to choose between accepting an attack from above or repositioning. Either choice gives Nolan an opening. The closer to space the fight gets, the worse for Homelander, because his lungs are not adapted in the way Viltrumite physiology is. If Nolan deliberately drove the fight upward into thinner air, he could exhaust Homelander's effective combat capacity before Homelander could deal a single decisive blow. The endgame here is not even a question. Nolan in thin air, Homelander gasping, Nolan finishing the exchange with a single committed strike. Scenario 3. They meet in a closed environment, an interior, a building, a vehicle. This is the scenario where Homelander has his best chance, because tight spaces compress fights and reduce the advantage of mobility. In a small interior, Nolan cannot use his flight comfortably. He cannot accelerate at full speed without breaking through walls. He cannot use his preferred approach of repositioning and choosing the angle of attack. He has to fight at close range with no setup. Homelander, who is comfortable in close-range exchanges against weaker opponents, gets a less unfavorable opening. He still loses, but he buys more seconds. The reason he still loses is that in close-range exchanges, Nolan's experience is even more decisive. Nolan knows where to hit a humanoid body to disable it. He has done it hundreds of times. He has done it to humanoid aliens, to mutated humans, to other Viltrumites. The fact that Homelander's body is humanoid in shape is, in a closed environment, a problem for Homelander, not an asset. Nolan would target a specific weak point, drive his hand through it, and the fight would end the way the Aquarus kill ended in the first episode of the show. Quietly, decisively, with no monologue. Scenario 4. They meet with preparation. Homelander knows Nolan is coming, has access to Vought's research, and has time to choose his ground. This is the scenario where the matchup gets genuinely complicated, and where the honest answer requires admitting more uncertainty. Homelander, given preparation, could in principle bring weapons with him. He could in principle set the meeting in a location that has been pre-stocked with Vought's anti-soup materials. He could in principle bring allies. The show has established that Vought has produced weapons capable of injuring soups of his tier. In a scenario where the fight begins with Homelander already holding such a weapon, the matchup tightens. We do not know the upper limit of those weapons. The show has been careful not to define it. The most honest read is that, given preparation and the right Vought weapon, Homelander could in theory introduce a variable that would force Nolan to retreat or to take more damage than he would otherwise take. Whether the weapon could actually kill a Viltrumite is unknown. The show has not shown Vought weaponry doing damage at the level Viltrumite combat requires. The default assumption, drawn from what is on screen, is that the weapon could buy Homelander a few seconds. It would not change the outcome. But this is the scenario in which the outcome is closest to being changed, and it is the one a thoughtful pro-Homelander argument would have to make. Scenario 5, the inverse, which is rarely discussed but which is genuinely interesting. They meet with preparation, but Nolan is the one prepared. Nolan, given preparation, would do what he has always done. He would not show up looking like Omni-Man. He would show up looking like Nolan Grayson, the husband, the writer, the slightly cold father, and he would arrange to meet Homelander in a setting where Homelander did not understand that the fight had begun. The show has shown Nolan, in the first episode, doing exactly this. He had drinks, he chatted, he was warm, he killed when he was ready. There is no version of a Homelander preparation that survives that approach. The fight would not begin with a punch. It would begin with a conversation. By the time Homelander realized he was in a fight, the fight would be more than half over. This is the scenario most pro-Nolan arguments do not even need to make, because it is so heavily in his favor. But it is the most accurate depiction of how a Nolan fight begins. In all 5 scenarios, Nolan wins. In one of them, Scenario 4, he wins more slowly and with more damage taken. In the other 4, he wins quickly and with the kind of finality that does not leave room for a sequel. That, more than any single feat of strength or speed, is the honest answer to the matchup. Homelander, for all his power and all his menace and all the writing room's care, is a different category of being from a Viltrumite, and Nolan, in particular, is the version of that category that has spent the longest time perfecting violence as a craft. The internet often frames this fight as if it is close. It is not close. It is one of the more lopsided matchups in modern fiction, dressed up as a fair fight by the visual similarity between the two characters and by the fact that both shows live on Amazon. If you separate the two of them from their marketing imagery and look at them as characters, the gap is enormous. That said, we should be honest about why the gap is enormous. It is not because Homelander is poorly written. It is because the two shows want different things from their leads, and the things they want are incompatible. The Boys wants Homelander to be the most powerful being in his world, while still being vulnerable to the human characters around him, because the show is about humans confronting the impossible. Invincible wants Omni-Man to be the most powerful being in his world, while still being a real obstacle for his son and for the heroes who oppose him, because the show is about generational conflict between superhuman beings. The first kind of power is a power that has to be tameable, occasionally, by characters who cannot match it. The second kind of power is a power that has to be threatening to other characters who can match it. The two scales do not overlap, because they are not measuring the same thing. Homelander is the strongest character on a scale where humans matter. Nolan is a middling character on a scale where Viltrumites matter, and Viltrumites operate orders of magnitude above where the Boys lives. When you put them in the same room, the scale collapses, and Nolan wins not because he is better written, but because the room he comes from is built taller. There is one comparison the internet keeps returning to that we should sit with for a while, because it actually illuminates the matchup in a useful way, which is the parallel between Nolan and Mark, and the parallel between Homelander and Ryan. Both shows have given their lead a son, and both shows have used that son to explore what their lead is capable of becoming. The way each show handles that son tells you almost everything you need to know about the difference between the two characters. Mark, in Invincible, is the audience's anchor. He is the one who looks at his father and slowly understands what his father is. The first season ends with him in a beaten heap, his bones broken, his face barely recognizable, listening to his father explain why his short human life cannot matter to a being whose lives are measured in millennia. Mark's answer, simple and quiet, that his life with the people he loves would be his actual life, is the moment Nolan's worldview cracks. The crack does not close. From that moment forward, every choice Nolan makes is the choice of someone who has been seen by his son and who cannot quite go back to who he was. The story treats the relationship as a real, slow, painful renegotiation between father and son, with all the messiness that suggests. By later seasons, the relationship has become something that resembles a kind of distant guardianship, with Nolan still capable of terrible violence, but never directing it at his son again. The writers, in interviews, have talked about this as a deliberate inversion of the standard superhero father story. Nolan is not the wise mentor. He is the threat that the hero has to grow past, and then, once the hero has grown past him, he becomes a strange, uncertain ally. Ryan, in The Boys, is something different. He is not the audience anchor. He is the leverage. Homelander discovers his existence in a way that the show treats as a small reveal, but a large character beat. And from that moment forward, his relationship with the boy is the most morally complicated thread in the series. He wants to be loved by Ryan. He wants Ryan to inherit the role that he himself was forced into. He wants to teach Ryan what it means to be a super, and the show is brutal about how poorly he understands what that lesson should be. The relationship is not a slow renegotiation. It is a pull, with Ryan caught between Homelander and Butcher and his mother's memory, and with Homelander treating every loss of Ryan's attention as a personal wound. The show has used this thread to demonstrate, more than any other thread, how needy Homelander really is. He wants his son to love him in a way that real fathers do not require their sons to love them, in a way that is closer to demanding worship than offering parenthood. The show is not subtle about the fact that this is a problem. The reason this matters for the fight is that both characters can be reached through their sons, but only one of them in a way an opponent could use. Nolan, in his current form, would not allow a threat against Mark to make him hesitate in a way that opens an opening. He would, if anything, become more deadly. A version of the fight in which Homelander threatened Mark would end faster, not slower, because Nolan would simply remove the threat with whatever force was necessary. Homelander, in his current form, would respond to a threat against Ryan in a much less predictable way. The show has demonstrated that his attachment to Ryan is a vulnerability, that it can paralyze him, that it can produce moments where he prioritizes performance over action. A version of the fight in which Nolan calmly identified Ryan as a tool for psychological pressure, which Nolan absolutely would, gives Nolan another lever. He would not have to use it, but he could. The voice and the performance, since this is a comparison of two leads who both rely heavily on the actor giving them voice, deserve their own moment. J.K. Simmons, who voices Omni-Man, is one of those actors whose face does not appear and whose voice somehow communicates more than the animation. The way he calibrates Nolan's warmth and Nolan's coldness, sometimes in the same line, is a quietly impressive piece of acting. The first season finale would not land the way it lands without the way he delivers the lines about the dog, the time scale, the inevitability. He does not raise his voice. He does not perform villainy. He simply uses the same warmth he uses with Mark in the early episodes, and lets the content of the words do the work. That is a very different kind of menacing performance from the one Antony Starr gives as Homelander, which is openly performative, full of physical tics, full of small smiles that turn off and on, full of moments where the actor is using his body to telegraph that there is no consistent person behind the mask. Both are extraordinary performances. They are extraordinary in opposite ways. Simmons is hiding the monster. Starr is showing the absence where a person should be. That difference, again, maps onto the matchup. Simmons's monster is more dangerous, because you do not see it until he has chosen to use it. Starr's absence is more dangerous, because nothing is restraining it. But against each other, in a contest of who can hide an attack until it lands, Simmons wins. We should also spend some time, while we are here, on the way each character has been written across multiple seasons, because both shows have evolved their leads in ways that change how this fight reads. The Homelander of the first season of The Boys is not the Homelander of the most recent season. The early version is a controlled product. He is unsettling because of the gap between his image and his behavior, but he is still, mostly, in control of his impulses. As the show has gone on, that control has frayed. By the most recent seasons, he has been depicted as openly emotional, openly unstable, willing to do things in public that the early version of him would have done only in private. The show has used this drift to argue that the longer he is the most powerful being in his world, the less stable he becomes, because there is no one left to discipline him. The version of him you have to imagine in this fight is therefore not the calm corporate Homelander of Season 1. It is the late season version, where the mask has slipped and where the public performance has started to crack. That version is more dangerous in some ways, less competent in others, and the matchup against Nolan changes accordingly. Nolan, similarly, is not a static character. The Nolan of the first season is the Nolan we have been describing for most of this video. The calm, controlled, deceptive Viltrumite at the height of his confidence. The Nolan of the second season is a wounded version, captured, imprisoned, slowly being walked through the question of whether his Viltrumite identity is something he can shed. The Nolan of the most recent material is something stranger again, a version of the character who has accepted his exile from Viltrumite ideology without becoming, exactly, a hero. The version of him you have to imagine in this fight is, again, not the late version. It is the version at his peak, the version who walked into the Guardians' headquarters and walked out alone. That is the version Homelander would have to beat. It is worth mentioning, while we are on the subject of versions, that both creators have been asked about this fight, in public, in interviews. Eric Kripke, the showrunner of The Boys, has spoken with some humility about how he sees Homelander against Omni-Man, suggesting in various conversations that, by most accounts of his comments, he considers Omni-Man more powerful in a straight fight, partly out of respect for the writing of Invincible, and partly because he understands the difference between a character built for a human-scale show and a character built for an alien-scale show. Robert Kirkman, who created Invincible, has been less direct, but the various interviews and podcast appearances he has done over the years suggest he agrees. Neither creator has framed this as a serious competitive question, the way the internet has. Both have treated it as a friendly conversation between writers who respect each other's work and who understand the scales their respective shows operate on. That is, in itself, a quiet answer to the matchup, although we should be careful not to overweight what creators say in interviews. They are reading their own shows like anyone else, and the shows are the actual evidence. Speaking of evidence, There is one episode comparison worth dwelling on, because it is the closest direct evidence we have of how each character handles a fight against a peer. For Nolan, the cleanest evidence is the Chicago sequence at the end of the first season of Invincible, where his fight with Mark sprawls across multiple city blocks and includes some of the most violent images the show has produced. The sequence is often called one of the most graphic fight scenes in animation, and the comparison to other animated battles in the same medium is reasonable. What it shows, beyond the violence, is how Nolan fights when he has no reason to hide. He uses the environment. He uses speed. He uses precision. He uses, also, the specific psychological vulnerability of the opponent, his love for his father, which he exploits across the sequence with a deliberateness that is hard to watch. For Homelander, the cleanest evidence is the Soldier Boy fight in the third season of The Boys, where his clash with a comparable soup produces visible damage on both sides and ends without a decisive resolution. The sequence is shorter, more contained, and less environmentally devastating than the Chicago sequence, but the key beats are clear. Homelander is hurt, surprised by the level of force he is taking, and ultimately willing to retreat rather than accept further damage. The two sequences, watched back to back, tell you the entire story of the matchup. There is also a worthwhile production note here, which is that the Invincible team, in interviews and behind-the-scenes commentary, has talked openly about how the Chicago sequence was animated, what the storyboard process looked like, and what the goal of the sequence was. The team has discussed the difficulty of making animation feel weighty, of communicating impact through stylized drawings, and of pacing a fight that runs longer than the standard animated set piece. The Boys team, similarly, has talked in interviews about the practical and visual effects work that went into the Soldier Boy sequence, about how they balanced the show's grounded visual style with the need to depict soup versus soup combat at a scale higher than the show usually shows. Both teams clearly cared about their respective sequences. Both sequences are well made. The difference between them is what they are willing to show, and that difference is, again, a function of which show is built taller. To go further with this, we need to step back from the two specific characters and acknowledge what they are, as a literary category, because that category explains both why people compare them and why the comparison resolves the way it does. Both Omni-Man and Homelander are, in the simplest reading, examples of the evil Superman archetype, the trope of taking the iconic American superhero and asking what would happen if his moral certainty was the surface of something much darker. The trope has a long history in comics, going back to work by Mark Millar, going back to Garth Ennis's run, going back even further to the Plutonian in Irredeemable, going back to the Sentry in Marvel, going back to Hyperion in various Squadron Supreme stories. And it has been so thoroughly explored that almost any modern story trying to do it has to bring something specific to justify the addition. Robert Kirkman, in interviews, has talked about Invincible's relationship to the Superman archetype in his comic, and the show inherits that engagement. Garth Ennis has been more direct in his own interviews about the comics that became The Boys, where his critique of the superhero genre is unmistakable from the very first issue. Both projects are aware of the tradition they are joining. Both projects are doing something specific with it. What Invincible does specifically is treat Omni-Man as a character whose evil is the product of cultural conditioning, an empire that taught him what strength means, and whose redemption arc, such as it is, takes place over years of having his cultural assumptions challenged. He is not evil because he is broken. He is evil because he was raised in a culture that defined evil out of its vocabulary, and his arc is the slow process of finding the word again. That is a coherent psychological reading. It explains his calm, his certainty, and his slow drift away from his early position. What The Boys does specifically is treat Homelander as a character whose evil is the product of trauma and corporate manipulation, a man who was never given a chance to develop a stable identity because the system that produced him needed an unstable one. He is not evil because he was raised in a bad culture. He is evil because he was raised in no culture, with no one to be his actual parent and no community to be his actual context. The two readings produce two very different characters, even though the powers, the costume, the surface presentation, all of those are similar. This is also where we can talk about the comic versions a little more honestly, because the comic versions illuminate something. In Kirkman's original comic, Nolan's arc goes further than the show has yet shown. Without spoiling beats the show has not aired, we can say that the comic depicts Nolan dealing with the consequences of his Viltrumite identity over a long arc that takes him through interstellar war, through political shifts on Viltrum itself, and through a kind of late-life reconciliation with his family that the show may or may not eventually portray. The comic also depicts the Viltrumite race in ways that emphasize their physical scale, their political structure, and their long-term goals. The comic is less interested in atmospheric questions about whether Viltrumites can survive in deep space, and more interested in showing them doing it. The comic also, importantly, depicts Viltrumite combat against beings of comparable or greater power, including the Coalition forces and various enemies of the Empire, in ways that establish how a Viltrumite at Nolan's level fares against opposition. If we treat the comic as additional context for the show, which the show treats it as some of the time and not others, the picture of Nolan's ceiling gets even higher than what the show has shown. In the original Homelander of the comic, similarly, there are beats that the live-action show has not used and probably will not use, including a much darker depiction of his sexual psychology, his relationship with various other supes, and his eventual fate. The comic's Homelander is, in some readings, less psychologically coherent than the show's, because the show has worked harder to give him a continuous arc. Antony Starr's performance, working with the writer's room, has produced a Homelander who is more developed than the comic version, more capable of the moments of vulnerability and theatricality that make the show's version so distinct. If we use the comic as additional context for the show, the picture of Homelander gets messier, not clearer, which is to say, the comic version does not raise the ceiling on his abilities in any meaningful way. Both shows, on net, are the strongest version of each character. We are not cheating either side by sticking with what is on screen. This leads to one of the more interesting subplots of the cultural conversation around this matchup, which is the way fans have used these two characters to argue about what kind of superhero story they want. Among Invincible fans, there is a tendency to read Nolan as a more philosophically serious character because his evil is structural, the product of an ideology rather than an individual pathology. Among Boys fans, there is a counter-argument that Homelander is a more politically serious character because his evil is the product of a system, an entertainment industrial complex, an institution, and that the show's interest in his theatricality is itself a critique of celebrity. Both arguments have merit. Both miss the actual point, which is that these are two different kinds of stories trying to do two different things, and that comparing them at the level of seriousness is a category mistake. Invincible is interested in the structures that produce monsters. The Boys is interested in the audiences that feed them. The two stories are not competitors. They are companions. That last point is worth dwelling on, because it changes how the fight reads in a useful way. If you treat Nolan and Homelander as competitors, the fight feels like it should be close, because the stakes are competitive. If you treat them as companions, doing different work in different registers, the fight feels less like a competition and more like a thought experiment, and the asymmetry stops feeling like a defeat for Homelander. Yes, Nolan would win. Of course Nolan would win. He is a centuries-old Viltrumite with the lived experience of an interstellar warlord. Homelander is a corporate product who is afraid of being seen as small. The match was always one-sided. The interesting question is not who wins. The interesting question is what each character represents, and what each character's loss to the other would mean. A Nolan loss would mean that physical power is not the highest form of competence, and the show would never write that, because it does not believe it. A Homelander loss would mean that performance is no defense against substance, and the show absolutely does believe that, because the show has been saying it from episode 1. Let's talk then about what kind of finishing move each of them would use, because that is the most concrete way to think about the closing window of the fight. Nolan, in the show's pattern, finishes opponents in one of three ways. He hits them through something, usually a structure or a vehicle or a body of water. He hits them with a beam, usually at close range, usually at a precise anatomical target, or he holds them and crushes them. The first is the most theatrical. The third is the most personal. The second is the most efficient. Against Homelander, who is durable enough to survive the first but not the second or third, Nolan would probably opt for the second or third, because he has had enough time across the seasons to understand that the cleanest kill is the one that does not give the opponent a chance to deliver a counter. The image of Nolan, having decided the fight is over, taking Homelander by the head and applying force in a precise vector, is the most likely closing image of the fight. It is not graphic for the sake of being graphic. It is what the show has done before. It is what the show would do here. Homelander, in his show's pattern, finishes opponents in one of three ways as well. He delivers a heat vision strike to a vulnerable area, often the head, often through a wall. He performs a public execution intended to be witnessed, or he allows the opponent to suffer for a while before delivering the final blow, usually because his emotional state requires the suffering to be drawn out. Against Nolan, the first would not work, because Nolan can take a heat vision strike to the head and continue. The second cannot work, because Nolan would never allow himself to be positioned for it. The third cannot work, because Nolan would never allow the fight to last long enough to be drawn out. None of Homelander's preferred finishing moves are available against this opponent, which is, in a strange way, the deepest argument for why the fight is one-sided. It is not just that Nolan is stronger. It is that the specific techniques Homelander has spent his life refining are useless here. There is one more category of analysis we should run, before we get to the verdict, which is the question of allies. Both characters, in their respective shows, have networks. Nolan, in the universe of Invincible, has the entire Viltrumite Empire as a potential resource, although the Empire's relationship with him varies across the show. He also has, complicatedly, his family. He also has, in various episodes, the global network of heroes who either trust him or fear him. Homelander, similarly, has Vought International behind him, with all the legal, scientific, and military resources that implies, and he has, more directly, the rest of the Seven, with whatever mix of loyalty and fear is operating in any given season. In a one-on-one fight, which is what the matchup is usually framed as, the networks do not enter. In a broader scenario, they do. If the question is not just who wins a single fight, but who survives an extended conflict, the Viltrumite Empire is a heavier weight on the scale than Vought, by a long margin. Vought is a corporation. Viltrum is an interstellar military force that has spent thousands of years subjugating entire civilizations. There is no version of an extended conflict in which Vought's resources are the deciding factor against an empire that can move planets. That is a footnote, really, because the matchup as it is usually framed is one-on-one, and the one-on-one analysis is what we have done. Worth noting all the same, because the show writes Nolan as part of a structure, and the show writes Homelander as the center of a structure, and structures fight differently from individuals. To go deeper on Nolan's combat profile, we should spend a longer moment with the Viltrumite military culture that produced him, because the culture is itself a kind of evidence. In the show, every Viltrumite we have met is a soldier. Their society is structured around conquest and around the maintenance of physical excellence. They breed for strength. They train from a young age. They are taught, the show implies, a coherent philosophy of violence, the idea that pain is the test that decides whether a being is worthy of existence. That philosophy is monstrous, and the show treats it as monstrous, but the philosophy also produces a remarkably effective fighting force. When Nolan encounters other Viltrumites in the show, his fights with them are not the fights of two equals. They are the fights of two beings trained in the same school, with the same kind of body, with the same kind of expectations of pain. Even when he loses, the way he loses is informed by training that has no equivalent in human, or supe, experience. He knows how to surrender just enough to stay alive. He knows how to lose tactically. He knows how to allow himself to be captured, if capture is the better short-term option. That kind of survival discipline does not appear in Homelander's profile. The Boys has not depicted him as someone who has ever had to surrender. He has been embarrassed, he has been humiliated, he has been hurt, but he has never had to fight a being who could actually kill him, except that the fight was lost, and choose the survival option. The version of Homelander we have seen across the show's seasons does not have that toolkit. In a long fight against Nolan, in a situation where the fight had clearly turned, Homelander would either fight to death or attempt to escape in a way that Nolan, trained in the long tradition of Viltrumite warfare, would predict and intercept. There is no version of this where he gets away. There is also the question of pain tolerance, which both shows treat seriously, but which the two leads have very different relationships with. Nolan has been depicted, in the show, taking impacts that would render most beings unconscious, and remaining functional. He has been depicted with broken bones, with internal damage, with the kind of bleeding that suggests serious internal injury, and continuing to fight, or to talk, or to act. The Viltrumite physiology, in the show's telling, simply does not register pain the same way human, or even most soup physiology does. There is a steady tolerance there, and a slow recovery, that gives him more usable time inside an injured state than other characters get. Homelander, by contrast, has been depicted reacting to pain in ways that look more human, recoiling, hesitating, taking time to recover from blows. He has not been shown taking the kind of sustained punishment Nolan has taken and continuing to fight. The difference is significant, because in a long fight, the side that can keep moving while injured has an enormous advantage over the side that needs a moment to recover. The way these traits combine in a fight gives the long version of the answer. Nolan, hit by a clean Homelander strike, would absorb it and counterattack within the same beat. Homelander, hit by a clean Nolan strike, would need a moment, however small, to reset. That small moment is the moment in which the fight escalates one direction permanently. Nolan would land a second strike during Homelander's reset. He would land a third before Homelander could deliver his next attack. Once the rhythm of the fight tilted, by even a fraction, it would not tilt back. Homelander cannot interrupt a Viltrumite combat rhythm any more than a sprinter can interrupt the rhythm of a moving freight train. The metaphor is overstated, but only slightly. There is also the awkward question of what would happen if Homelander attempted his usual psychological tactic, which is to threaten bystanders or use a third party as leverage. This is the move he has used in The Boys to keep certain confrontations from escalating, the implicit or explicit threat of harming someone the opponent cares about. Against Nolan, the move would not produce a useful pause. Nolan, in the show, has accepted the deaths of bystanders during fights. He has, at certain points, used bystanders as leverage himself. He would not be paralyzed by a threat to a third party. He might, depending on the third party, be motivated. If the bystander were Mark or Debbie, the motivation would not slow him down. It would accelerate him. The move that ends most Homelander confrontations would, against Nolan, simply remove the brakes from a fight Nolan was already controlling. That is an uncomfortable image, and it is worth pausing to acknowledge that we are talking about the fight in a way that is genuinely violent. The show treats violence as having consequences, and the same standard should apply to this kind of analysis. We are not celebrating the outcome. We are working out, honestly, what a fight between two depicted characters would look like, based on what their shows have actually shown us. The discomfort of that exercise is part of what makes the analysis useful. Both shows want their audiences to feel that discomfort. Both shows would, in their own ways, be unhappy with a clean, glorified fight scene between these two leads. The fact that the matchup is grim is not a flaw in the analysis. It is the actual point. We have not yet discussed the question of training and reflex, which is closely related to experience, but not identical. Nolan's training, drawn from his upbringing in Viltrumite military culture, includes specific drills, specific techniques, and specific philosophies of combat. He has been shown, in flashbacks, going through what amounts to formal combat education. He has been shown, in the present day, executing techniques that have the hallmarks of practiced movements rather than improvised ones. Homelander, by contrast, has been depicted as largely self-taught. He has not had a real coach. He has not had peers to spar with. Vought has tested him, used him, marketed him, but the show has not depicted him in any extended training environment with someone his own size. His techniques, when he does use them, look improvised. His punches are wide. His kicks are theatrical. His use of his powers in combat is reactive rather than planned. That gap between trained and self-taught is enormous at the level we are talking about. A trained fighter against a self-taught fighter, when both are at the upper bound of their body's capabilities, is not a fair fight. There is also, importantly, the question of how each character has been shown to fight while distracted. The Boys has depicted Homelander struggling, sometimes badly, to maintain focus during emotionally charged confrontations. He has been shown losing the thread of a conversation because of an insult. He has been shown delaying necessary action to deliver a monologue. He has been shown using attacks as expressions of mood rather than as tactical choices. Invincible has depicted Nolan as almost preternaturally focused. Even in his most emotional sequences, including the first season finale with Mark, he never stops paying attention to the room. He notes details. He tracks possible threats. He measures the people around him. In a fight that involved any kind of conversation, any kind of attempt at humiliation, any kind of psychological warfare, Nolan would maintain focus while Homelander would not. That is, on its own, a fight-winning trait. Now we should circle back to one of the more specific arguments the internet has had about this matchup, which is whether Homelander could win by leveraging his speed advantage in a single, decisive opening exchange. The argument runs that Homelander, if he committed entirely to a first strike, could potentially exploit a moment of inattention on Nolan's part and land a fight-ending blow before Nolan could react. The argument depends on Homelander's speed being meaningfully higher than Nolan's, which we have already established is not the consistent read from either show. It also depends on Nolan having a moment of inattention, which we have also already established is not consistent with how the show depicts him. Even granting both premises, the argument runs into the further problem that there is no clear Nolan kill zone. Homelander's first strike, even at his full output, even targeted at the head or the chest, would not be enough to end the fight against a Viltrumite at Nolan's level. The Chicago fight establishes that. Mark, an immature Viltrumite, takes much more than that and continues to be functional. The kind of strike Homelander could land in a surprise opening simply does not exist at the level required. There is a more sophisticated version of the same argument, which is that Homelander's first strike, while not fight-ending, could create an opening for a sustained attack with multiple follow-ups. That version is more plausible. If Homelander committed entirely to a fast, multi-blow opening sequence, leveraging surprise, leveraging the heat vision, leveraging close-range strikes, he could in theory put Nolan on his back foot briefly. The honest version of the matchup says this is possible. The honest version also says that Nolan, on his back foot briefly, is far more dangerous than Homelander at his peak, because Nolan's instincts in that situation are to escalate and finish, not to disengage. The opening Homelander could create would close in the same exchange he created it. Nolan would respond, in the show's pattern, by taking the next clean opening and ending the fight. The Homelander victory path here is short and does not actually exist. There is one specific cultural moment about this matchup that we should sit with, because it has shaped almost every online conversation about it for years now, and that is the famous animated short, the unofficial fan animation that depicted Omni-Man and Homelander fighting, and that briefly became one of the most watched pieces of fan content on the internet. Without quoting the dialogue from the unofficial production, because the unofficial production is not canon for either show and we should be careful not to treat fan animation as evidence, we can say that the short kicked off a kind of permanent conversation in fan spaces. The two characters were briefly inseparable in the algorithm. Compilation videos comparing them, side-by-side power rankings, debate threads about who would win in different scenarios, all of it bloomed at once and has continued for years. The phrase associated with the unofficial fan animation, the one that the internet has not stopped repeating, has become a kind of shorthand for the broader argument that Omni-Man is operating at a level Homelander cannot reach. In the end, it is just a fan production, and the actual analysis should rest on what the canonical shows show. But the meme has shaped the conversation in ways that are worth acknowledging, because half of the people watching this video came to it expecting that meme to be addressed. What the meme has correctly captured, in its way, is the imbalance we have been describing for hours. The reason it caught fire is that it matched, in shorthand, what careful viewers of both shows had already felt. The reason it persisted is that subsequent material from both shows did not change the picture. The reason it still gets quoted is that it is, by accident or design, an accurate read of what the canonical material has actually shown. The internet sometimes settles on the right answer for the wrong reasons. In this case, the internet's collective intuition that Nolan is a level above Homelander matches what a careful analysis of the actual shows would also conclude. The two have arrived at the same answer by different routes. There is, however, a counter-meme, which we should also acknowledge, which is the body of fan analysis that treats Homelander as a higher-tier character based on his role in his own show. The argument runs that Homelander is the supreme threat of his universe, that his universe has not produced a being who can definitively kill him, that the show treats him as the apex of soup physiology, and that on his own terms he is at the ceiling. All of that is true within The Boys. The counter-argument is that ceilings are not interchangeable. The ceiling of The Boys is much lower than the ceiling of Invincible, because the two shows are operating on different scales. Being the apex of The Boys is not the same thing as being the apex of Invincible. The Boys is, in the most literal sense, a smaller universe in terms of power scaling. That is not a criticism. It is a description. To make the scaling difference vivid, consider the kind of opponent each show treats as a meaningful threat. The Boys, in its most cosmic moments, has introduced soups with very specific exotic abilities, with the ability to manipulate matter or mind, with strength in the upper range of Soldier Boy class, with the ability to hurt Homelander under the right conditions. These are real threats in the show, and the show treats them seriously. Invincible, by contrast, has treated Viltrumites as the standard against which all threats are measured. The show has introduced beings beyond Viltrumites, including the Mahler twins' more powerful experiments, including various cosmic entities, including Conquest, the Viltrumite warrior who arrives in the second season and whose fight with Mark is one of the most punishing sequences in the show. Conquest is, by most accounts of the show's lore, older than Nolan and more committed to Viltrumite ideology than Nolan. The fight with Conquest is, in many ways, the closest Invincible has come to depicting what a fully unleashed Viltrumite fight looks like, and the level of destruction in that sequence is on a different scale from anything The Boys has ever depicted. If we use Conquest as a yardstick, the gap between The Boys' combat ceiling and Invincible's combat ceiling becomes vivid. Homelander, in The Boys' framing, would be a threat to humans and to weaker supes. Conquest, in Invincible's framing, threatens entire planets. This brings us to a useful thought experiment, which is the question of where in the Invincible power hierarchy Homelander would actually sit if he were dropped into that show. The honest answer is that he would be somewhere in the upper middle. He would be more powerful than the average Guardian of the Globe. He would be less powerful than a fully trained Viltrumite. He would be roughly comparable in raw output to Mark at the end of the first season, although less experienced and less psychologically stable. He would be, in other words, the kind of threat that Mark and his allies have routinely dealt with, individually or in teams. He would not be a Nolan-tier opponent. He would be a Battle Beast-tier opponent, although less ferocious and less specialized. That assessment is not an insult. It is the most accurate placement of his capabilities within Invincible's power scaling, given what both shows have shown. The reverse exercise is also useful. Where in The Boys' power hierarchy would Nolan sit? The answer there is at or beyond the top. He would be more powerful than Homelander. He would be more powerful than Soldier Boy. He would be roughly equivalent in some areas, and more powerful in most, than the most cosmic supes the show has introduced. He would, in The Boys' framing, be a planetary threat. Vought would not have the tools to contain him. The Boys, as a team, would not have the tools to harm him. The show simply has not produced a being on his level. That is the matchup, viewed from the other side. It is not a close fight. The only honest version of the analysis is one that acknowledges this. There is a related question worth asking, which is what kind of story you would have to write to make Homelander a threat to Nolan, and the answer is instructive. You would have to give Homelander a power-up of some kind. You would have to give him a weapon, or an ally, or a specific environmental advantage that the canonical Homelander does not have. You would have to engineer the matchup, and once you engineered it, you would have to give Nolan a corresponding handicap, because the canonical Nolan would still win. The amount of story tooling required to make this a fair fight is significant. The fact that the internet feels the matchup should be close is, in part, a function of how much story tooling has been done in fan content to make it close. The canonical version is not close. Now we should give space to the version of this argument that is the most generous to Homelander, because it is intellectually honest to put the strongest case for the losing side on the record. The most generous case runs roughly as follows. Homelander has not been fully tested. The Boys has been deliberately cagey about his ceiling, because the show needs him to be vulnerable to its main cast. If we extrapolate from his maximum on-screen feats, including some of the more violent crowd scenes, including some of the more cosmic moments of the recent seasons, we could in theory argue that his ceiling is higher than what the show has shown. We could in theory argue that the show is restraining him for narrative reasons, and that in a real fight, freed from those narrative reasons, he would output far more than he has been depicted outputting. That argument is real, and a thoughtful Boys fan can make it well. The reason the argument does not change the outcome is that the same reasoning applies to Nolan. Invincible has also restrained him for narrative reasons. The show has not depicted his full capability because the show needs him to be vulnerable to Mark, to the Coalition, to the various forces that the story requires him to fight, on roughly even terms. If we extrapolate from his maximum on-screen feats, including the Conquest tier moments, including the Coalition battles, we could in theory argue that his ceiling is also higher than what the show has shown. The two extrapolations cancel out. If we let both characters operate at their narrative ceiling, Nolan still wins. If we let both characters operate at their unrestrained ceiling, Nolan still wins, by a wider margin. The argument that Homelander is being restrained is true, but it is not a path to a Homelander victory. There is also a version of the argument that depends on specific exotic abilities Homelander might have that we have not seen. This argument runs that the show has only shown a fraction of what Vought engineered into him, and that there could be abilities we have not seen because the story has not required them. That is, technically, true. We do not know everything about his physiology. But the same is even more true for Nolan, whose Viltrumite physiology has been depicted as having capabilities we have not fully seen, including resistances and adaptations that the comic has explored further. Speculation about unseen abilities is a wash. It cuts both ways. The honest analysis, the one we are doing here, has to stick with what is on screen, and what is on screen says Nolan wins. Before we get to the verdict, let's spend a long moment with what the matchup says about each show as a piece of art, because the comparison illuminates the writing in ways that watching either show in isolation does not. The Boys, as a show, is interested in the impossibility of trust. Its central insight is that the people who present themselves as protectors are exactly the people who have the most to hide, that the institutions that exist to serve the public are the institutions most likely to exploit it, and that the language of moral certainty is most often spoken by people who have never had to test their moral certainty against real pressure. Homelander, in that frame, is not a character so much as a thesis. He is the image of the trusted protector hollowed out, played by Antony Starr with such commitment that the hollowness becomes its own kind of presence. The show is, at every moment, daring you to feel sympathy for him, and at every moment pulling that sympathy away once you have started to feel it. That is the project. That is what the show is doing. Invincible, as a show, is interested in something different. Its central insight is about the inheritance of trauma, about how children become like their parents even when they swear they will not, about how a son who watches his father do something terrible cannot, easily, become a son who does not contain the possibility of the same act. Nolan, in that frame, is also not really a character. He is also a thesis. He is the inheritance Mark spends the entire show trying not to take on, even as the show keeps showing us that the inheritance is more complicated than refusal can solve. Mark cannot just refuse to be his father. The Viltrumite biology will carry parts of his father into him regardless. The cultural conditioning, the assumption of physical dominance, the willingness to use violence as a problem-solving tool, all of it is in the inheritance, and Mark spends seasons trying to figure out how to live with parts of it while rejecting other parts. The show is, in a way, a long meditation on what it means to be the child of a war criminal who also raised you with love. These are different projects, with different stakes, and the comparison between them clarifies something for each. Homelander is what happens when a corporation creates a person without giving him a real childhood. Nolan is what happens when a culture creates a person and then sends him to a planet that does not share his values. Both are studies in conditioning, both are studies in identity under pressure, but they study different conditions, and their characters carry different freights. The internet has noticed the similarity in surface, the blonde hair, the cape, the laser eyes, the smile that does not quite reach the eyes. The internet has not always noticed the difference in subject. The Boys is about us, the audience, and what we ask our heroes to be. Invincible is about families, biology, and the question of whether love can survive across very different scales of life. That difference in subject is why, finally, the matchup is interesting. The fight is not just a fight. It is a meeting of two studies, each operating in its own register. The reason Nolan wins is not just that his power scaling is higher. It is that his show is interested in a question, generational inheritance, that requires him to be more substantial as a fighting being than Homelander's show, which is interested in a different question, public performance requires Homelander to be. Each character is exactly as powerful as his show needs him to be. Nolan's show needs him to be a peer to other Viltrumites. Homelander's show needs him to be a person who is afraid of being seen as small. The fight is one-sided because the writing rooms wanted different things, and the things they wanted produced characters at different weights. Let's go through the verdict now, slowly, and state it cleanly so that nothing in the conclusion is left ambiguous. Omni-Man wins. He wins because his strength ceiling, as demonstrated against other Viltrumites and against beings like Battle Beast and Conquest, is higher than the strength ceiling Homelander has demonstrated against Soldier Boy and the supes around him. He wins because his speed in combat is more consistently and reliably higher than Homelander's. He wins because his durability against peer-level force is greater. He wins because his flight ability is more flexible, more comfortable in extreme environments, and effectively limitless in ways Homelander's is not. He wins because his heat vision, while not necessarily stronger in output, is more disciplined in application. He wins because his senses, while comparable in resolution, are wielded with more military precision. He wins because his experience, centuries of interstellar combat, is fundamentally incomparable to the corporate stage fights Homelander has spent his life performing. He wins because his training is real, formal, and continuous. He wins because his psychological stability, while imperfect, is far more reliable in combat than Homelander's deeply theatrical and easily destabilized psychology. He wins because his pain tolerance, his willingness to absorb damage and continue, is one of the deepest and most reliable Viltrumite traits. He wins because his preferred finishing moves are designed to end peer-level combat, while Homelander's preferred finishing moves are designed for opponents who cannot fight back. He wins, finally, because the kind of being he is, a Viltrumite, was specifically designed by Robert Kirkman to be a fictional response to Superman, in a register that takes the Superman archetype to a much darker conclusion than The Boys does. The Boys takes the Superman archetype and asks what kind of person would emerge from a corporate version of his upbringing. Invincible takes the Superman archetype and asks what kind of culture would emerge if there were millions of Supermans organized into an empire. The first question produces a character who is dangerous to the people around him. The second question produces a character who is dangerous to entire civilizations. The fight is not close, because the questions are not close. That said, let us also be honest about what Homelander would do in the fight, because it is a story moment worth imagining. He would not go quietly. He would not accept the defeat once it became clear. He would, in the show's pattern, escalate into the most theatrical version of himself once he understood that the calmer version was losing. He would try the heat vision early, hoping for a fight-ending shot. He would try the speed, hoping to land a surprise blow. He would try the threats, hoping to find a hostage who could be useful. He would try the monologuing, hoping to buy time and information. Each of these moves would fail, and the failure of each one would push him further toward the version of himself that does not care about consequences. The endgame would be ugly. The endgame is always ugly when Homelander is losing. The image that would close the fight is one of the saddest things either show has implied is possible, although neither show has shown anything quite like it. It is the image of Homelander, having understood that the fight is lost, taking one final swing not to win, but to be remembered as having tried, and Nolan, having watched the swing develop, ending it with one of the precise techniques his training has been preparing him to use for centuries. The show would not necessarily linger on the moment. Invincible has, throughout its run, been willing to depict violence without dwelling on it, willing to acknowledge the cost of a fight without staying inside the goriest beat. The fight would end. Nolan would stand. He would look down at the body. He would, perhaps, take a single moment to acknowledge that he had just ended the most powerful product of a fundamentally different storytelling tradition. And then he would leave, because that is what he does. He does not stand over the bodies. He does not pose. He does not celebrate. He acts, and then he leaves. There is one more layer of analysis worth doing, before we close out, which is the question of what the fight would mean to the world it took place in. If we imagine the fight inside Invincible's world, the world would barely register it. The Viltrumites have killed many beings at Homelander's tier. The Empire's history is full of conquests that produced collateral on a scale that makes a single Supa death look like a footnote. Nolan, after winning, would return to whatever he was doing. The world would move on. If we imagine the fight inside the Boys' world, the consequences would be catastrophic. The death of Homelander, at the hands of an alien being from another universe with no political affiliation, would shatter Vought's entire architecture. The Seven would collapse. The American public's faith in supes, already cracked, would shatter. The corporate model of selling superheroes would, at least temporarily, lose its center. The show has been building toward exactly that kind of collapse for years. In some readings, Nolan winning the fight is the kind of thing that would conclude The Boys' central thesis, by demonstrating that the very framework of trusted protectors was always more fragile than anyone believed. There is, of course, no version of either show in which this fight actually happens. The two shows live on the same streaming service, but they live in entirely separate universes, with no overlap, no shared continuity, and no plausible bridge. The matchup is hypothetical and will remain hypothetical, but the analysis is still useful because it sharpens what each show is doing. Watching Invincible, with this analysis in mind, you see more clearly how the show treats Nolan as a being of a different scale from his American superhero peers. Watching The Boys, with this analysis in mind, you see more clearly how the show treats Homelander as a being who is dangerous, precisely because he is small inside a body that is too large. Both readings are deeper for the comparison. That, in the end, is the reason the matchup has stuck around for so long. It is not because anyone needs an answer to who wins. It is because thinking about who would win sharpens what each character is. The fight is, in that sense, a lens, and looking through it makes both shows clearer. Now that we have arrived at the verdict, and now that we have walked through the analysis at length, we can spend some time on the surrounding texture, the small details that make both characters feel real on screen, the supporting casts that orbit them, the moments that fans return to, the scenes that have become reference points. We have a long way to go before we are done, and these next stretches are the ones where you can let your attention drift if you need to, because we are simply going to wander through the parts of both shows that make the characters who they are. Start with the supporting characters around Nolan. Debbie Grayson, his human wife, is one of the most carefully written spouses in superhero fiction, partly because the show takes her seriously as a person and not just as a function. She is not a damsel. She is not a foil. She is a woman who has spent close to 2 decades being married to a being she did not fully understand, who slowly comes to understand, through the events of the first season, that the man she loved was lying to her in a fundamental way. Her arc through the second season, dealing with grief, anger, and the practical problem of raising Mark on her own, is one of the show's quieter triumphs. She matters to the matchup we have been discussing because she is a reminder of what Nolan was pretending to be for all those years. The cost of that pretense shows up in her in every scene. It shaped how Nolan calibrated his behavior, what he allowed himself to show, what he allowed himself to feel. That calibration is part of what makes him so dangerous in a fight, because he has practiced, for 2 decades, the art of hiding what he is until the moment he chooses to reveal it. Cecil Stedman, the head of the Global Defense Agency, is another important figure in Nolan's orbit. Cecil is, in the show's framing, the closest thing Earth has to a Stan Edgar, a corporate or governmental figure whose job is to manage superheroes from the outside. He has access to weapons, to surveillance, to political pressure, to a global network of operatives, and he has, repeatedly, used those resources to manage situations involving Viltrumites. His relationship with Nolan, before the first episode's reveal, is one of cautious collaboration. After the reveal, it becomes one of ongoing strategic management. Cecil understands, in a way few characters in the show understand, that Nolan is a threat that cannot be defeated by conventional means, and that has to be lived with, contained, and used when possible. The show treats Cecil's role with moral ambiguity, never quite suggesting that he is right, and never quite suggesting that he is wrong. He is, in the matchup we have been discussing, the kind of character who would be useful to either side as an ally, because he understands the political dimensions of beings at this scale better than almost anyone else. He would not, in a Nolan versus Homelander situation, be able to do much directly. But he would understand, immediately, what was happening, and he would make decisions about who he was willing to support, and his support would change the meta around the fight, even if it did not change the fight itself. Stan Edgar, the head of Vought in the early seasons of The Boys, is Cecil's nearest analog, and the comparison is instructive. Edgar, played in the show by Giancarlo Esposito, is a corporate strategist of remarkable poise, who understands Homelander's psychology better than Homelander does, and who manages him by playing on his needs rather than by trying to control his actions. Edgar's exit from the show, dramatic and humiliating, is one of the moments that breaks Homelander's last meaningful tether to the corporate framework that produced him. Without Edgar, Homelander becomes more dangerous in the obvious ways and less competent in the subtle ways. He no longer has the gentle constraint of a figure who knows how to redirect him. The version of him in the fight we have been imagining is, in part, the post-Edgar version, the one who has lost the only character who knew how to handle him. That is, again, an advantage for Nolan, because a Homelander without a handler is a Homelander whose decisions in combat are less informed and more reactive. Mark Grayson, Nolan's son, is the character who matters most for understanding what Nolan does and does not do. The relationship between father and son is the engine of the entire show, and it shapes how Nolan behaves in almost every scene where he is on screen. The first season's climax, with father and son fighting through Chicago, is a sequence whose violence is in service of a question, the question of whether a son has to become his father, and the answer the show gives is complicated and ongoing. Mark, after that fight, carries the physical scars of it and the emotional weight of it for the rest of the show. He has to decide, repeatedly, whether to be the kind of hero his father was not, while also accepting that he has the same body, the same biology, the same potential for the same acts. Watching him try to be different from his father, while also having to fight in ways that increasingly resemble his father's methods, is one of the most painful and rewarding ongoing arcs in modern superhero fiction. The show does not let him simply be the better version of Nolan. It makes him work for it, and it makes him pay for it. Ryan, Homelander's son, is the closest analog, and again the comparison is illuminating. Ryan is younger than Mark, and his arc is correspondingly less developed, but the central question is similar. He is the child of a being whose values are catastrophic, and he is being pulled between competing influences who want different things for him. Homelander wants him to inherit the throne. Butcher wants him to be saved from inheriting anything. His mother, while she was alive, wanted him to be a normal child. The show has not yet resolved which influence will win, but the resolution will be one of the defining moments of the series' ending. The contrast with Mark is sharp. Mark has the choice taken out of his hands by his father's actions, and has to work out who to be in the aftermath. Ryan has the choice repeatedly offered to him, and has to navigate it while still being a child. Both shows treat the inheritance of a superhuman father as one of the central problems of their universes. Neither show treats it as a simple problem. The other soups around Homelander are worth a moment as well, because they shape the texture of the world he lives in. The Seven, as a team, are a collection of broken people who have been organized into a corporate marketing structure. Maeve, Starlight, A Train, The Deep, Black Noir, and the various others who have rotated through the team are all characters with their own pathologies and their own histories of abuse at the hands of Vought. The team functions, in narrative terms, as a kind of distorted Justice League, with each member offering a darker version of a familiar archetype. They matter to the matchup in a small way, because they are the closest peers Homelander has, and the way he treats them tells us how he handles people he considers near his level. He bullies them. He humiliates them. He uses them. He kills them when they become inconvenient. There is no model in his life for how to behave around someone he considers a genuine equal, because he has never had one. That gap in his social experience would, in a fight against Nolan, show up immediately, because he would not have any idea how to read another being at his own scale. The heroes around Nolan, by contrast, function very differently. The Guardians of the Globe, the Teen Team, the various other heroes who orbit the Grayson family are mostly written as people who are trying their best in a world that is bigger than they can quite handle. They are not a marketing structure. They are not a corporate product. They are a collection of individuals who have chosen, more or less freely, to wear the cape, and who have to deal with the consequences of that choice. Nolan, before his reveal, treats them with a kind of polite contempt that the show plays as a character trait without explaining until the reveal arrives. After the reveal, his disdain for them becomes legible. He never considered them peers. He considered them, in the Viltrumite sense, lesser beings, useful for cover, but not for anything else. That is one more piece of context for the matchup, because it tells us how Nolan thinks about beings who are less powerful than he is. He does not respect them. He uses them, or removes them, depending on circumstance. The version of him that would walk into a Homelander fight would walk in with that same disposition. Homelander is not a peer. He is, in Nolan's terms, a lesser being who has confused himself with a Viltrumite. The fight would, for Nolan, be a reminder. There is one more orbit worth describing, which is the cosmic side of Invincible. Alan the alien, the coalition of planets, the various interstellar forces that exist in the show's wider universe, all suggest a scale of conflict that does not exist in The Boys at all. The Boys is, fundamentally, a story set on Earth. The wider world it depicts is not cosmic. Invincible, by contrast, is a story that increasingly takes place across multiple worlds, with implications for entire civilizations. Alan, as a character, is interesting in this context because he is the first being other than Nolan to be depicted as operating at a Viltrumite tier, and his relationship with Mark, growing across seasons, becomes one of the show's central friendships. The existence of Alan, and of the Coalition, and of the wider galactic political structure tells us that Nolan is part of a larger network of beings at his level, while Homelander is not part of any such network. The Earth and Vought are essentially the limit of Homelander's world. The galaxy is the actual scale of Nolan's. That difference in scope matters for the matchup, because it means that even if Homelander somehow won the fight, he would face a much larger response from Nolan's broader context than he could handle. Vought would not respond at all to a Nolan victory, because Vought has no awareness of Viltrumite political structures and no leverage against them. There are a handful of specific scenes from each show that come up so often in this discussion that it is worth taking each of them in turn, slowly, and looking at what they actually show, separate from the way they are sometimes misremembered. We have already touched on the Guardians fight, the first season finale confrontation, and the Chicago sequence from Invincible, and the Soldier Boy fight from The Boys, but they all reward closer reading. The Guardians fight is, in some ways, the cleanest piece of evidence about Nolan's combat profile that the show has produced, because it is the longest sustained sequence of him fighting opponents who are not Viltrumites and who are doing their best to survive. The Guardians, in the canon of the show, are presented as Earth's top-tier protectors, with abilities ranging across speed, strength, mystical power, telekinesis, transformation, and martial arts. They are not pushovers. In any other show, they would be the protagonists. Nolan kills them, in sequence, in a fight that takes longer than the average fight on the show, but shorter than it should have, given how many of them there are. The sequence is choreographed to communicate something specific. It is not that Nolan is overwhelming them with raw power. It is that he is, technically, the better fighter. He uses environment, he uses precision, he uses information about each opponent that he has clearly accumulated over years of working alongside them. The Aquarius moment, the Red Rush moment, the Martian Man moment, each of them lands because Nolan knew, before the fight began, exactly what each of these characters could do and how to neutralize it. The Guardians fight is not just a power feat, it is a knowledge feat. He killed them because he understood them. That kind of knowledge-based combat is something that simply has no parallel in Homelander's profile. The Boys has not shown him studying his opponents in detail. He does not, in the show's depiction, take the time to learn the specific weaknesses of the various supes he kills. He simply applies overwhelming force in whatever direction is convenient, and because he is usually the strongest person in the room, the overwhelming force is enough. In a fight against Nolan, who is stronger than him and who would presumably arrive with at least some research, the lack of a knowledge-based combat habit would be a real problem. Nolan would have studied Homelander before the meeting. He would have watched the available footage. He would know what Homelander does in fights. He would have a plan. Homelander would have, at best, a vague intention. The first season finale confrontation between Nolan and Mark is, in another way, the best piece of evidence about Nolan's psychology. The scene is, on its surface, a conversation between father and son, but it is also a closing argument from a being who has spent his life inside an ideology that he is in the process of beginning to question. He explains, calmly, why his Viltrumite worldview justifies what he has done. He explains, calmly, why human lifespans should not matter to a being of his scale. He explains, calmly, why the value of a partner like Debbie should be understood differently when viewed from across centuries of life. The argument is monstrous, and the show treats it as monstrous. But the argument is also coherent. It is a worldview, not a tantrum. The scene is the show telling us, very clearly, that the character we are watching is not a creature of impulse. He is a creature of consideration. He has thought about what he believes. He has built a framework for his actions. He may, at the end of the scene, be in the process of having that framework challenged, but the framework exists. Compare that to almost any monologue Homelander delivers across the seasons of The Boys, and the contrast is sharp. Homelander's monologues are not closing arguments from a coherent worldview. They are emotional discharges. They are needs being expressed. They are demands for validation. He does not, in any scene I can think of, lay out a stable philosophical position about what he is and why he does what he does. He simply expresses, in escalating registers, the feelings he is having at that moment. That is also a writing choice, and it is a successful one. The show does not need him to be philosophically coherent, because the show is about, in part, the emptiness behind his image. But it does mean that in a confrontation that included any element of dialogue, Nolan would be operating at a higher rhetorical level than Homelander, with the same kind of advantage in mental combat that he would have in physical combat. Homelander, in dialogue with Nolan, would lose the conversation before any punches were thrown. The Chicago sequence, from the first season finale, is the closest the show has come to depicting Nolan at his peak physical output, and it is one of the most discussed action sequences in modern animation. The sequence runs across what feels like miles of city, with the fight escalating from buildings to transit lines to highways and back to dense urban centers. The violence in the sequence is graphic, and it has been pointed at as evidence of how far animation can push depictions of impact. What is sometimes lost in discussion of the visual intensity is how carefully the sequence is paced as a piece of character work. Mark is fighting back the entire time, but every time he lands a blow, Nolan absorbs it, responds, and escalates. Every time Nolan has the option to end the fight, he draws it out, because the fight is, for him, not just a fight. It is a teaching moment, a last attempt to bring his son into the Viltrumite framework. The sequence ends with Nolan literally throwing his son through a high-speed train, with civilian casualties implied, and then, in the closing beats, choosing not to deliver the final blow because something in Mark's argument has reached him. It is the only fight in the show that ends because of words, not because of one fighter killing the other. The fact that words can stop Nolan, in extremity, is a piece of character information that matters for the matchup. Homelander, in the analogous position, would not be stopped by words. He would also not be in a fight where words could plausibly be exchanged for that long. The two scenes do not have an equivalent in Homelander's life. The Soldier Boy fight, from the third season of The Boys, is the cleanest piece of evidence about Homelander's actual combat ceiling, and it deserves a more careful look. Soldier Boy, as the show writes him, is a Vought-era soupe of the original generation, with strength and durability comparable to Homelander's, but with a chemical or radiation pulse component that allows him to release energy in bursts that damage other soups. The fight, when it finally arrives, is intense but short. Homelander is visibly surprised by how much damage Soldier Boy can do. He retreats, he recovers, he returns later, with allies. The honest read of the fight is that Homelander could not, on his own, defeat Soldier Boy in a sustained one-on-one engagement. He needed help, he needed time, he needed a particular set of circumstances. Soldier Boy, by most accounts, is roughly at the level of the middle tier of Viltrumites. Nolan is several levels above Soldier Boy. The transitive math is not subtle. There is one more iconic moment from The Boys that often comes up in this discussion, which is the moment when Homelander, in a fit of public emotion, lasers an innocent person in front of a crowd that turns out to support him. The scene is one of the show's most disturbing, and it has been read as a critique of mob psychology, of celebrity culture, of fan complicity in the actions of the powerful. It is a powerful piece of writing. What it tells us, for the purposes of this fight, is that Homelander's primary register of physical violence in the show is not actually combat. It is execution. He kills people who cannot fight back, and he does so in ways that are designed to communicate to an audience. In a fight where there is no audience, where the opponent can fight back, that primary register is unavailable to him. He has to fight in a register he does not have practice in. Nolan, by contrast, fights in the register he has practiced for centuries. The mismatch is again fundamental. There is also one final iconic moment from Invincible worth flagging, which is the Battle Beast sequence in the second season. Battle Beast, in the show, is a powerful and dangerous opponent, large, fast, and capable of inflicting serious damage on multiple Viltrumites at once. The fight involving Battle Beast is one of the most desperate sequences in the show, and it gives us a sense of what kind of being can pressure a Viltrumite outside of other Viltrumites. The implications for the matchup are that beings at Battle Beast's level are above Soldier Boy, and above Homelander, but still below Nolan when Nolan is operating at full capacity. We can use that data point to triangulate. Nolan handles Battle Beast tier opponents. Soldier Boy is below Battle Beast tier. Homelander struggles with Soldier Boy. The placement of Homelander, in the Invincible scale, sits below Battle Beast, which means below the level Nolan operates at in his more difficult fights. The math is uncomfortable for Homelander. Let's talk for a while about why this matchup, more than almost any other crossover hypothetical the internet has spent time on, has had the kind of staying power it has had. There are dozens of versus matchups that catch fire briefly and then die in the algorithm. This one has not died. It comes back, every time either show releases new material, every time a clip resurfaces, every time a fan animation makes its way into the recommendations. There is something specific about this matchup that the internet cannot let go of, and it is worth thinking carefully about what that something is. Part of it, certainly, is the surface similarity, the blonde hair, the cape, the flight, the lasers, the general resemblance to a particular long-established archetype. Two shows producing two characters that look this similar, releasing within roughly the same window of time, on the same streaming service, creates a kind of natural matchup question that the algorithm rewards. Part of it is also the timing of their respective cultural breakthroughs. Invincible's first season landed at a moment when audiences were primed for darker takes on the superhero genre, partly because of the success of earlier seasons of The Boys, partly because of broader cultural conversations about whether the standard superhero story had said everything it had to say. The two shows ended up being framed, in the early reviews and in the broader cultural conversation, as twin examples of what the genre could do when it took itself seriously about consequences. But the deeper reason the matchup has stuck around, I think, is that it speaks to a particular kind of question the internet likes to ask, which is the question of whether power or psychology determines outcomes. The pro-Homelander side, when it makes its strongest case, is essentially arguing that psychology beats power, that the more dangerous mind wins, regardless of the body it is in. The pro-Nolan side, when it makes its strongest case, is essentially arguing that power and competence beat anything else, that a stable, trained mind in a stronger body cannot be outfought by an unstable, untrained mind in a weaker body. The two arguments are interesting as a thought experiment about how violence actually works. The matchup gives the internet a clean way to argue about that thought experiment, with two characters who exemplify the opposite extremes of the same kind of being. There is also, I think, a generational element to the matchup's appeal. Both shows came of age in a moment when audiences had grown tired of the cleaner, more reverent treatment of the superhero archetype that had dominated the previous decade of cinema. Both shows offered a corrective, in different registers, and the audiences who connected to them were audiences who wanted the genre to admit that there were uncomfortable implications baked into the premise. Putting Nolan and Homelander in the same imaginary room is, in a way of asking which corrective is better, which dark mirror more accurately reflects what we should be afraid of when we imagine real beings with these powers. The answer changes depending on what the asker is afraid of. People who fear corporate power and celebrity reach see Homelander as the more salient warning. People who fear ideological conditioning and inherited violence see Nolan as the more salient warning. The two characters are not just fighting in the imagined matchup. They are arguing for the worldview that produced them. It is worth saying out loud that this kind of cultural conversation, the way the internet metabolizes crossover hypotheticals, is itself something both shows are interested in. The Boys has, repeatedly, depicted its supes interacting with their own audiences in ways that hold up a mirror to how real audiences interact with real celebrities. Invincible has, less obviously but no less seriously, depicted the way Earth's public reacts to the presence of superhuman beings, the way attention curdles into worship or hatred. Both shows know that they are being watched by audiences who are themselves participating in the cultural systems the shows are critiquing. The matchup conversation, the years of fan animations and meme videos and ranking arguments, is in some sense the natural continuation of what the shows are about. Audiences making content about the comparative power of fictional violence is a behavior the shows have noted, sometimes implicitly, sometimes more openly. There is also, finally, the simple fact that both characters are wonderfully entertaining to think about. Nolan, as a character, rewards rewatching. The first time through the first season, you experience the reveal. The second time through, you experience the dread of knowing what is coming, while watching the show pretend it is a different kind of show. The third time through, you start to notice the small choices the writers made to plant the reveal early without giving it away. Homelander, similarly, rewards rewatching. The first time through, you experience the dawning horror of who he is. The second time, you start to see the patterns in his behavior, the cycles of need and humiliation, the way his actions follow a logic he himself does not understand. Both characters are deep wells, and thinking about them in relation to each other is a way of going deeper into both of them. The matchup is, in a sense, a study guide. Working out who would win forces you to articulate what each character actually is. That, more than any specific power scaling argument, is the value of the conversation. There are a few common misunderstandings about both characters that we should clear up before we close, because they show up in almost every online debate about the matchup, and they distort the conversation. The first is the idea that Omni-Man, in the show, has lost fights to opponents who are weaker than Homelander. This is sometimes argued based on his struggles with the Mauler twins and his various injuries across the seasons. The argument misreads the show. His struggles with weaker opponents are not because they are above his weight class, they are because he is, in those scenes, restraining himself for narrative reasons, or because he has been ambushed in ways that exploit his specific overconfidence. The version of him in our matchup is not ambushed and not restrained. He is operating at full capacity, with the same intentionality he brought to the Guardians' fight. The supposed evidence of his weakness is, on closer inspection, evidence of how he chooses to use his strength in particular situations, not evidence of what he is capable of. The second common misunderstanding is the idea that Homelander, in The Boys, has demonstrated abilities that put him at Nolan's level. This is sometimes argued based on his maximum on-screen feats, including his ability to outpace various vehicles, his ability to lift very large objects, and his ability to project his heat vision over long distances. The argument misreads the scaling. His maximum on-screen feats, while impressive within The Boys, do not approach the level of Nolan's casual depictions. Lifting cars is not the same as throwing humanoid bodies through trains. Outpacing fighter jets is not the same as crossing solar systems. The scaling difference is real, and dismissing it requires ignoring what both shows have actually shown. The third common misunderstanding is the idea that Homelander's psychology gives him an upset path through unpredictability. This is the strongest version of the pro-Homelander argument, and we have already addressed it. The brief version is that Nolan's experience includes encounters with unpredictable opponents, including Battle Beast and various other beings whose tactics resemble Homelander's worst impulses. Nolan reads those tactics and counters them. He would do the same here. The unpredictability path is not actually as unpredictable as it looks from inside the boys' narrower world. Nolan has fought Stranger. The fourth common misunderstanding is that, because Homelander is voiced and performed by a more famous performer in the live-action medium, his character is somehow more developed or more capable. This is a category error. Antony Starr's performance is, indeed, one of the great pieces of television acting of the last decade, but the show's writing has chosen to give him certain capabilities and not others. J.K. Simmons' voice work as Omni-Man, while less visually prominent because of the animation, is similarly committed and similarly carefully calibrated to the show's intentions. Both performances are excellent. Neither performance changes the underlying physical capabilities of the character being performed. Confusing the quality of performance with the level of power is a mistake the conversation often makes, and it should be set aside. The fifth common misunderstanding is that because The Boys is the live-action show and Invincible is the animated show, the matchup is somehow not comparable. This is the laziest version of the argument and the easiest to dismiss. Animation is a medium, not a genre. The Invincible animation is not a children's cartoon. It is a serious adult superhero drama that uses animation as its visual style. The matchup between Nolan and Homelander is comparable for the same reason that the matchup between any two characters from any two shows is comparable. We work from what each show has established, on screen, about each character, and we reason from there. The visual medium does not change the underlying capabilities. The animation does not deprive Nolan of his speed, any more than the live-action style grants Homelander his power. Both characters exist at the level their shows have established for them. Let's spend the last long stretch of this video thinking about what each character has been used to mean, both within their own stories and in the broader conversation, because that meaning is where the matchup actually lives. We have spent hours now working through who would win the fight. The answer is, as we have argued, that Nolan wins, with very few exceptions and very little ambiguity, given what the canon shows us. But the fight is also, on a level above the body count and the strength scaling, a fight between two visions of what is wrong with the superhero idea, and that level rewards slow attention. The Boys, in Homelander, has built a critique of celebrity, of corporate manipulation, and of the audience's complicity in the bad behavior of the powerful. The show has, across its seasons, gotten more pointed, more political, more direct in its mockery of the cultural systems that produce and protect figures like its lead. Homelander, by the most recent seasons, is something close to an allegory, with the show treating his rise and his audience's relationship to him as commentary on real cultural movements. That allegorical edge has produced some of the most discussed sequences in the show. It has also produced moments where the show's writing has been criticized for being too on the nose. Either way, the project is clear. The Boys is asking, repeatedly and loudly, what kind of society produces a Homelander, and what kind of society keeps producing one even after it sees what he is. The matchup with Nolan, viewed from inside this project, would mostly be a way of asking what happens when the kind of being the Boys is afraid of meets a kind of being it has not, in its own world, ever had to write. Invincible, in Nolan, has built a different kind of critique, one that is interested in the philosophy of long-lived beings, in the politics of empire, and in the relationship between a parent's ideology and a child's identity. The show is less directly political in the American sense than The Boys, but it is no less political in the wider sense. It is asking, across its run, what it would mean to be a being of a different scale from the people you love, and whether love can survive that kind of scale. It is asking what kind of culture produces beings who can do what Nolan does, and what kind of person, raised inside that culture, could begin to question it. The matchup with Homelander, viewed from inside this project, would mostly be a way of asking what happens when a being formed by a serious and coherent imperial culture meets a being formed by a hollow and incoherent commercial culture. The answer, which is that the serious culture wins, is also a small part of Kirkman's wider argument across the show, which is that ideology, even when it is wrong, is more dangerous than narcissism, because ideology can be passed on. Thinking about it this way, you can see that the matchup is not actually about which character is better written. Both characters are written extraordinarily well, in their own registers. The matchup is about which critique of the superhero archetype has more weight, and the answer, in physical terms, is the one that asks the bigger questions. Nolan, as a critique, is asking about cultures, biology, and inheritance. Homelander, as a critique, is asking about audiences, performance, and corporate structure. The Nolan critique operates at a scale that includes the Homelander critique, because corporations and audiences are subordinate phenomena of cultures and biology. The reverse is not true. You cannot get from a critique of celebrity to a critique of empire without expanding the frame. The Nolan critique, in other words, contains the Homelander critique as a special case. The fight reflects that containment. Nolan does not just beat Homelander, he beats the kind of critique Homelander represents, by being a critique that operates at a larger scale. That is, perhaps, the most useful frame I can offer for why the fight resolves the way it does. It is not that one character is more powerful than the other. It is that one character is operating at a level of conceptual abstraction that the other character cannot reach. Homelander, for all his menace, is bounded by the cultural conversation his show is having. Nolan, for all his calm, is bounded by a much larger cultural conversation. When you put them in the same room, the smaller conversation gets absorbed by the larger one. Homelander does not just lose the fight. The conversation about him gets quieter, because the conversation about Nolan is louder. That is what happens when an empire's representative meets a corporation's representative. The corporation finds itself negotiating from a position it did not realize it was in. There is one more interpretive note to add, which has to do with what these two characters do to their respective worlds even when they are not in the same room. Homelander, across his show, has been the engine of a slow collapse. The institutions of his world have decayed under his influence. The relationships have frayed. The soups around him have been hollowed out one by one. The trajectory of The Boys, as a story, is toward the kind of collapse that ends a system. Whether the show concludes with that collapse achieved or merely begun, the trajectory has been clear for years. Nolan, by contrast, has been the engine of a slow rebuilding in his show. After the catastrophe of the first season, the work of the subsequent seasons has been about how Earth, the Coalition, the Viltrumite Empire, and the various other power centers in the show negotiate a future that does not repeat the catastrophe. The work is uneven, painful, and incomplete. But the trajectory is constructive rather than destructive. The show is interested in what gets built next, while The Boys is interested in what falls down next. That difference is consistent with the matchup. The character associated with rebuilding tends to outlast the character associated with collapse, in fiction and in life. There are exceptions. They are rare. Now we should think about what is next for each of them. The Boys has, by this point, made many choices about how to end Homelander's story, and the late seasons have telegraphed several possible conclusions. The show could end with him triumphant, the new face of a system that has accepted his rule. It could end with him deposed, replaced by someone who repeats his pathologies in a slightly different form. It could end with him dead, killed by Butcher or Soldier Boy, or another Supe, or by his own son. Each of those endings has fan support, narrative groundwork, and thematic resonance. The show's actual choice will, by the time you watch this video, either be known or be very close to known. Whatever the show chooses, the character's trajectory has been toward an ending. The Boys has not been writing him as a long-term presence in his world. It has been writing him as a problem that demands a resolution, and that resolution has been approaching for some time. Invincible, by contrast, has been writing Nolan as a long-term presence. The show has not been building toward his death or his exile or his replacement. It has been building toward his reconciliation with the consequences of his actions. The most recent material has shown him in a position that the early Nolan would not have recognized, a position that involves accountability without dissolution. He has been forced to live with what he did. The show has not let him forget, has not let him be redeemed in any clean way, but has also not let him die. He is the kind of character whose presence is built to outlast the show's specific arcs, because his unresolved guilt is one of the structures Invincible is built around. He is not a problem to be solved. He is a complication to be lived with. These different trajectories matter for the matchup in a final way, which is that the version of Nolan you have to imagine fighting Homelander is a version with a future. The fight is not, for Nolan, a climactic moment that defines him. It is one event in a long life that will continue. He would not invest the kind of emotional weight in the fight that Homelander would, because the fight is, for him, simply one more conflict in a series of conflicts that has spanned centuries and will span centuries more. For Homelander, the fight would be everything. It would be the test he has been waiting for, the proof of his standing, the resolution of every nagging doubt about whether he is the strongest being in any room he enters. The asymmetry of stakes is itself an asymmetry of capability. The fighter for whom the fight matters less is the fighter who can focus on the technical problem of winning. The fighter for whom the fight matters more is the fighter who is most likely to make the kind of emotional error that gives the technical fighter an opening. Nolan would fight to win. Homelander would fight to prove. The difference is significant. We have arrived, then, at the place where we can close. We have walked through the canonical evidence on both sides. We have considered the comic context where it adds rather than confuses. We have weighed the power scaling, the experience, the psychology, the training, the production decisions, the cultural meanings, and the trajectories of each character. We have considered the strongest version of the pro-Homelander argument, and given it its due. We have arrived, by every honest path the evidence supports, at the same conclusion. Omni-Man wins. He wins clearly, in most scenarios he wins overwhelmingly, and in the rare scenarios where the fight gets close, he still wins. The asymmetry is not because Homelander is a weak character. He is one of the great characters of modern television. The asymmetry is because the shows that produce them are built on different scales, and the larger scale absorbs the smaller one. If you are still with us, and I suspect by this point you have drifted into the part of the night where listening is enough and following the argument is optional, we can use the last stretch to think about why these two characters matter to us at all, separate from who would win. Because it is worth saying, after all this, that what makes the matchup compelling is not the answer. It is the asking. We do not really need to know who would win between two fictional people from two different streaming shows. The world will continue regardless. The fact that we want to know, the fact that millions of hours of video have been made about variations on this question, the fact that the conversation has continued for years now and shows no sign of slowing, tells us something about what we want from stories. What we want, I think, is to imagine being in a room with a being whose power makes our own lives feel small, and to ask, honestly, whether we would prefer that being to be coherent or theatrical, whether we would rather face the cold soldier or the unstable performer. The question has real weight outside the fiction. It is the question we keep asking, in much less interesting forms, about the leaders we elect and the executives we work for, and the people whose voices reach us through every screen and speaker we own. We want to know whether we are safer in a world of true believers or true narcissists. The two characters give us a clean way to ask the question without committing to a position about the real people we are actually thinking about. That is what fiction does at its best. It gives us a room to think in, with figures who can carry the weight of the thinking without breaking under it. And the answer that Invincible offers, that Nolan offers, is in some ways the more uncomfortable of the two answers. The Boys reassures us, in its way, that the dangerous figure is a hollow one, that the apparent menace is propped up by a corporation and an audience, and can be brought down if those structures are removed. Invincible offers no such reassurance. The dangerous figure in Invincible is not hollow. He is full. He has a coherent worldview. He has training. He has experience. He has access to institutions that operate on scales the show's heroes cannot easily reach. The show does not promise that he can be defeated. The show only promises that he can be lived with, complicatedly, in ways that demand constant work from the people around him. That is, in some ways, a more truthful picture of what coexistence with overwhelming power looks like. The Boys imagines a society that could, in principle, save itself by waking up. Invincible imagines a society that has to do the slower work of negotiating with what it cannot remove. Sitting with that, in the small hours, with the room cool and the screen dim and the narration drifting toward a close, you can feel why both shows have caught the attention of audiences who are tired of the cleaner versions of the same stories. We have lived for a long time inside the cleaner versions. We have watched the certain heroes save the certain worlds, and we have come, slowly, to wonder what would happen if the heroes were not quite so certain and the worlds were not quite so savable. Both shows answer that wondering, in different registers, and the answers are useful to have in the back of the mind, like books you have read that change the texture of how you read other books. What I find myself returning to, after all the hours we have spent on this, is the simple fact that both characters are written with care. Even when the writing is brutal, even when the depictions are graphic, even when the violence feels like more than the story strictly needs, there is, underneath all of it, a serious craftsperson working out what a character should be. That care is what makes the comparison worth doing. Two carelessly written characters can be compared, but the comparison teaches you nothing. Two carefully written characters can be compared, and the comparison teaches you something about both of them. That is what we have tried to do in this video, not to declare a winner for the sake of declaring a winner, but to use the matchup as a way of looking carefully at two characters who are, in their own ways, among the most thoroughly thought-out figures in modern television. There is one closing image I keep coming back to, which is the image of Nolan at the end of the first season finale, beaten, exhausted, bleeding, standing over his son and choosing not to deliver the final blow. The show does not let him off the hook for the choice. He has just killed thousands of people, by some calculations, in the course of the fight. He has just demonstrated to his son and to himself what he is capable of when his ideology is intact. The choice not to finish the fight does not redeem him. It only marks the beginning of the long work of redemption, which the show has spent every subsequent season suggesting may not actually be possible. But the image of a being who could have killed and chose not to is one of the show's defining moments, and it is in some ways the answer to the matchup we have been considering. Nolan, in this fight, would not be choosing whether to kill. He would be deciding when. The mercy is not in the table. The mercy is, perhaps, in whether he is in a mood to make the death quick. That is a colder thought than we might want at this hour, and I am sorry for it, but it is the honest one. For Homelander, by contrast, the closing image I keep returning to is the image of him alone, in a room, performing for an audience that is not there. The show has shown him doing this more than once. He stands, he poses, he delivers small speeches to no one. The performance is constant in him, because there is nothing inside him that is not performance. That is, in the end, what would lose him the fight. The performance has no audience in a fight against Nolan. The fight is, by definition, between two beings in a private space, however briefly. Homelander, in private, has no resources. Nolan, in private, has all of them. The two of them, alone together for the length of a fight, would be a meeting between a person who has spent his life preparing for that kind of meeting and a person who has spent his life avoiding it. The outcome would not be in doubt. So if you have stayed up with us through all of this, through the long walk through powers and psychology and history and culture, and you are now drifting near the edge of sleep, the takeaway you can carry into your dreams is this: both characters are wonderful. Both shows are worth your time. The matchup between them, while one-sided, is one-sided in a way that illuminates both of them, rather than diminishing either. You can love one and respect the other. You can root for one and recognize the other. You do not have to choose. The conversation can continue. The internet will keep making arguments. New seasons will produce new evidence. Fan animations will produce new memes. The fight, in some sense, never actually ends. It just continues, in different forms, in different rooms, between audiences who have been thinking about it for a long time, and audiences who are just now arriving. That is what stories do when they are good. They give us permanent rooms to argue in. We can come back anytime. We can leave anytime. The argument is still there when we return. Invincible, the show, has done something quietly remarkable in the time it has been on the air. It has taken the most familiar premise in superhero fiction, the boy who inherits his father's powers, and it has turned that premise into a series of meditations on inheritance, ideology, identity, and love that have produced one of the most consistently strong runs in modern animation. Robert Kirkman, after his work on The Walking Dead, has spent the last few years giving us a different kind of cultural object. One that is more difficult, more violent in stretches, and more tender in stretches, more thoughtful about what its characters owe each other and themselves. The show has built, season by season, a world large enough to hold the questions it is asking. That building is the thing I am most grateful for, watching it back. The careful construction of a fictional space that is large enough to hold real questions. Most superhero stories are not built that way. This one is. The Boys, similarly, has built something specific. Across its run, it has done something risky, which is to use a popular genre to mock the systems that produce the genre, while still being entertaining enough to keep the audience the show is mocking. The trick is hard. The show pulls it off, more often than not. The fact that the matchup between Homelander and Omni-Man exists in the cultural conversation at all is, in part, a tribute to how successful both shows have been at producing characters who feel real enough to imagine fighting. That is not a small accomplishment. Many shows produce protagonists whose names you remember and whose features you can picture and whose powers you can list, without producing characters who feel like they could exist in a room with another character from a different show. Nolan and Homelander both clear that bar. They are characters whose presence is portable. You can put them in any imagined room and feel that you know how they would behave. That is rare. If you are here to fall asleep, and you have been listening to my voice through this whole long walk through the matchup, I hope it has done what these videos try to do. I hope it has given your mind something specific enough to settle on, and something soothing enough in its rhythm to let you drift. The argument is over. The verdict is in. Omni-Man wins. He wins for the reasons we have explored, and the explanation is, if nothing else, complete. You can sleep on it. You can wake up tomorrow with the conclusion intact. You can return to the shows themselves on a different night and watch the evidence yourself and form your own opinions. The video will be here, the shows will be here, the argument will be here, waiting. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.